Dry Bones That Dream by Peter Robinson. Read by Neil Pearson. At 2:47 in the morning, the uniformed constable lifted the tape and waved Detective Chief Inspector Banks through the gate of Ardbeck Farm. Banks came to a halt in the bumpy farmyard next to a silver-grey BMW. To his left stood the squat, solid house with its walls of thick limestone. Ahead stood the barn. Some officers had gathered around its open doors, and they parted in silence to let him through. He noticed one young PC leaning against the wall, dribbling vomit onto his size 12s. Inside, the scene looked like a film set. Peter Darby, the police photographer, was busy videotaping. Meanwhile, a wave-faced young police surgeon, Dr. Burns, squatted, notebook in hand, by the grotesque shape on the floor. The body's position reminded Banks of Muslim prayer. Perhaps facing Mecca, the kneeling man bent forward, arms stretched out in front, bum in the air. But there was no forehead to touch the ground. Above the charcoal suit, the blood-soaked collar of the man's shirt protruded about an inch. After that, nothing but a dark, coagulated mess of bone and tissue spread out on the dirt like an oil stain. Shotgun wound, by the look of it. Patches of blood, bone, and brain stuck to the whitewashed stone walls in abstract expressionist patterns. Banks saw what looked like a fragment of skull sprouting a tuft of fair hair beside a rusty hoe. He felt the bile rise in his throat. He could still smell the gunpowder mixed with the stink of feces and the rancid raw meat smell of sudden, violent death. "What time did the call come in?" he asked the PC beside him. 1:38, sir. PC Carstairs from Relton was first here. He's still puking out front. Who's the victim? Name's Keith Rothwell. He lived here. Farmer? Nay, sir. Some sort of accountant. Banks turned his attention to the scene. The place had once been a large stone Yorkshire barn with double doors and a hayloft. Now, against the far wall, metal shelf units held antifreeze, wax polish, oily rags, screwdrivers, spanners, and other tools. But Rothwell had retained the rural look in the other half of his garage. He'd even hung old farm implements on the walls, a mucking rake, a hay knife, a draining scoop, all suitably rusted. And Banks tried to picture it here, the victim kneeling, perhaps praying for his life. Why had he submitted so easily? Not much choice, probably. You don't usually argue when someone's pointing a shotgun at you. He turned and left the barn. Outside, he met Detective Sergeant Philip Richmond and DC Susan Gay coming from round the back. "Nothing out there, far as I can tell, sir," said Richmond, a large torch in his hand. "Anyone know what happened?" "PC Carstairs spoke to the victim's wife when he first got here," said Susan. "Seems a couple of men were waiting when they got home. They took her husband out here and shot him. She's under sedation now, sir." She held up a plastic bag. "I fished his wallet from his pocket. His name's—" "Yeah, I know." At that moment, Detective Superintendent Gristhorpe arrived. He limped from his car, took a quick look in the barn, questioned PC Carstairs, then, his usually ruddy, pockmarked face a little paler, joined Banks. "Bloody hell, Alan." Above them, the stars shone cold and bright, like chips of ice on black velvet. "Let's go in the house, shall we?" The farmhouse was warm inside. It had been renovated according to the yuppie idea of rustic, with exposed beams and rough stone walls. The remains of a log fire glowed in the hearth. In front of it, two hard-backed chairs faced one another. One lay on its side, and its seat looked wet. Beside both lay coils of rope. Banks and Gristhorpe walked through into the ultra-modern kitchen, which looked like something from a colour supplement. Patterned tiles, microwave, oven, fridge, dishwasher, It also boasted a central island unit, complete with tall pine stools. PC Weaver was there, pouring boiling water into a large red teapot. "Tea's nearly ready, sir." "How's his wife?" said Gristhorpe. "Oh, there's a daughter too, sir. The doctor's seen them, both unarmed, but suffering from shock. Hardly surprising, really, since they found the body. They're upstairs now with WPC Smithies. Apparently there's a son, too, in America somewhere." "Who was this Rothwell bloke?" said Banks. "He must have had a bob or two." "Some sort of financial whiz-kid, I think. These newfangled kitchens don't come cheap, I tell you." Weaver stopped and stared at the door. Banks turned. A young girl stood framed in the doorway. "Hello. Are you the detectives?" "I'm Alison Rothwell. Someone killed my father." She was about 15, Banks guessed. She wore a baggy grey American football sweatshirt and a blue tracksuit bottom with a white stripe down each side. Her mousy blonde hair was parted in the centre, and her complexion was pale. "Wouldn't you rather be upstairs with your mum, love?" said Gristhorpe. "No, Mum's asleep. But I can't. It keeps going round in my mind. Can I tell you about it?" "Of course." Gristhorpe turned to Weaver. "Give the lass some tea, lad." He pulled out a stool for her. "You sure you feel up to this?" said Banks. "Yes, I think so." She took a deep breath. "It was just after dark, about 10 o'clock. I was reading, and I thought I heard a sound in the yard. At first I didn't pay it any mind and carried on. But then I heard another sound, maybe 10 minutes later, a sort of scraping." "And where were your parents at this time?" "Out. It's their 21st wedding anniversary. They went for dinner into Eastvale." "And you didn't go with them?" "No. I mean, it was their anniversary, wasn't it? Besides, I don't like Italian food." "OK. Carry on. What did you do? Weren't you frightened?" "Oh, a bit, maybe. But not really scared. I thought it was probably a fox or something. We get them sometimes." "So what happened?" "I opened the door and stepped out. Someone grabbed me, dragged me back inside and tied me to the chair. Then they put a rag in my mouth and put tape over it. I couldn't swallow properly. It tasted of oil." Banks saw her knuckles had turned white around her tea mug. "How many of them?" "2. Dressed all in black. They had balaclavas on with slits for the eyes." "How tall were they?" "Well, one was about as big as you." Banks was 5'9", quite small for a policeman. "The other was taller, 6 foot maybe, quite thin." "You're doing really well, Alison. What happened next?" "After they tied me to the chair, they sat and watched television." "They didn't harm you in any way?" Alison reddened. "When I was tied up, the smaller one came over and put his hand on my breast. But the other one made him stop." "How?" "Well, he said not to. It wasn't part of the deal." "Did he use those exact words, 'it's not part of the deal'?" "Yeah, I think so. It was the only time he said anything." "Did you notice his accent?" "Just ordinary. Local. Yorkshire, yeah. But not Dales, maybe Leeds or something." "Did you see any kind of weapon?" "Yeah, a shotgun. 2 barrels." "Who had it?" "A smaller man." "What happened when your parents came home?" Alison paused. "It must have been about 11:30. The men waited behind the door. The tall one grabbed Mum, while the other one put his gun to Dad's neck. I tried to scream and warn them, but the rag in my mouth, I couldn't make a sound." She ran her sleeve across her eyes and sniffed. "You don't have to go on. It can wait." "No, I want to. They tied Mum up too, and we sat there looking at each other. Then they went outside with Dad. Finally, we heard the bang." "How long between the time they went out and the shot?" I don't know. It seemed like forever, like time stretched out. Mum and I got really scared. Then we heard the explosion and... Alison began to shake. She dropped the mug, which spilled without breaking on the floor. Banks put his arms around her, and she clung to him, sobbing against his chest. Gristhorpe turned on the light in the upstairs room. "His office," said Banks. Two large desks formed an L shape. On one sat a computer, a laser printer, and a fax machine. Against the wall stood a hutch with compartments full of disks and software manuals. The other desk faced the window. This overlooked the farmyard, where the scene of crime officers were still going about their business under bright arc lamps. On this desk there was a jam jar full of pens and pencils, a blank scratch pad, an electronic adding machine, and an appointment calendar open at the day of the murder, May the 12th. The only things written there were Dr. Hunter, beside the 10 a.m. slot, and Mario's, 8:30 p.m. Gristhorpe pointed to the computer and grimaced. "We'd better get Phil to have a look at this lot. I wouldn't trust myself to turn the bloody thing on without blowing it up." Banks grinned at Gristhorpe's Luddite attitude towards computers. But Phil Richmond was known around the station as Phil the Hacker, and he ought to be able to tell them a thing or two. They walked out to the rear of the house and stood in the back garden. It was after 5 now, and a pale sun was rising slowly in the east. A few birds sang, and the air smelled moist and fresh. About a mile down the hillside, the village of Fortford was just waking up. Smoke drifted from chimneys as farm labourers prepared themselves for the coming day. Country folk were early risers. The whitewashed front of the 16th century Rose and Crown glowed pink in the early light. Banks knew the landlord there and thought it might be an idea to have a word with him about Keith Rothwell. He picked up a fair amount of local gossip. At last, Banks broke the silence. "They certainly seemed to know what was what, didn't they?" "You're thinking a hit?" "Oh, everything points to it. The coolness, the professionalism, it was all planned. The question is, why? Why should anyone want to execute an accountant?" "Sir?" They turned. One of the Sockos was approaching. "Sir, we found something. In the garage. You better have a look." They followed the officer back to the brightly lit barn. Rothwell's body had mercifully been taken to the morgue by now. Another of the men from the Socko team was holding something with a pair of tweezers. "What is it?" said Banks. "Wadding, sir, from the shotgun. You can either buy commercially made shotgun cartridges or you can reload the shells at home. Saves money." "That what this bloke did?" "Looks like. Commercial wadding's usually paper or plastic, but this isn't commercial." "So what is it?" The Socko passed him the tweezers. "I don't know for certain yet, but it looks like something from a colour magazine. Luckily it's tightly packed and only charred around the edges." "Anyone got a magnifying glass?" Banks addressed the assembly at large. "And no bloody cracks about Sherlock Holmes." One of the team passed him a rectangular glass. Banks held up the wadding and examined it. What he saw was a wad of crumpled magazine, no more than an inch across. He turned it this way and that, holding it closer and further away. Finally, he let his arm fall slowly to his side. "Bloody hell. What is it, Alan?" said Gristhorpe. Banks handed him the glass. "Look for yourself." He watched as Gristhorpe scrutinised the paper, knowing it would only be a matter of moments before he recognised, as Banks had done, part of a pink tongue licking a dribble of semen from the tip of an erect penis. By the time Banks arrived at Eastvale headquarters at 10 that morning, Gristhorpe had already given a brief press conference. The news would make local radio and television, the Yorkshire Evening Post, and the next day's national dailies. The superintendent had given hardly any details about the murder itself, but had released Rothwell's picture. He looked exactly as an accountant should, with thinning fair hair combed back, a high forehead, slightly prissy lips, and wire-rimmed glasses that had been found shattered to pieces along with the other wreckage of his skull. Gristhorpe was now in the conference room together with Richmond and Susan Gay. Banks joined them and poured himself a large black coffee. "Right," Gristhorpe said. "Time to get up to date. Alan?" "Not much so far. Some of the locals in Relton and Fortford knew Rothwell, but not well. Quiet sort of bloke, apparently, kept himself to himself." "Who'd he work for?" "Self-employed, apparently. I got that from the landlord of the Rose and Crown in Fortford. Rothwell used to drop by now and then for a quick jar, but never more than a couple of halves. It seems he used to work for Hatchard and Pratt here in Eastvale until he started on his own. The landlord had the impression Rothwell owned a few businesses as well, and that accountancy was becoming more of a sideline for him. And that's about it. The Rothwells have been living at Ardbeck Farm for 5 years. They used to live in Eastvale. I'm going out there again this morning." Gristhorpe nodded. "Good. Any leads on the 2 men?" "I spoke to someone who thinks he saw a car, sir." Gristhorpe looked at Susan. "A schoolteacher from Fortford was coming back over the moors around sunset last night. He saw a car parked by the side of the road, about a quarter of a mile from the farm. An old Escort, pale blue, he thinks. There's a copse opposite the farmhouse that would provide excellent cover if someone didn't want to be seen." "Sounds promising. Better follow it up. Get a description out. Anything on that wadding yet?" "Lab's still working on it," said Banks. "I've asked West Yorkshire to make inquiries at the kind of places that sell that sort of magazine. D.I. Blackstone at Millgarth in Leeds is an old mate." "Good." Gristhorpe turned to Richmond. "Phil, I want you to have a look at Rothwell's computer." "Yes, sir. Should we have it brought in?" "Aye." Gristhorpe scratched his pockmarked cheek. "Look, Phil, I know you're supposed to be leaving us for the yard at the end of the week, but it's all right, sir. I'll stick around as long as you need me." "Good lad. Susan, did you find anything interesting in Rothwell's appointment book?" "Not yet, sir. He'd an appointment yesterday with a Dr. Hunter, and it appears he kept it routine physical. No problems. I'm working my way through. He didn't write much down, though maybe it's all on his computer. Anyway, there are plenty of empty days in the book." "Maybe he didn't need the money and could afford to pick and choose his work. Look, have a word with his old firm, will you? They're in Market Street. They might be able to tell us something." Gristhorpe looked at his watch. "OK. Get to it." "I told Mother you're here," Alison said. "I'm afraid she was still in bed." And that was odd, Banks thought. Surely a mother would want to comfort her daughter and protect her from prying policemen. They were in a small, cheerful room with ivory-painted walls. Against one stood an upright piano with a highly lacquered cherrywood finish. W.P.C. Smithies, who'd stayed at the farm with the Rothwells, sat discreetly in a corner, notebook open. "Look, I know it's painful," said Banks, "but we need all the help we can get if we're to catch these men." "Yes, I know." "Do you remember hearing any sounds between the time they went outside and when you heard the bang? Any talking or sounds of a struggle?" "No. It was all so quiet, and I felt so powerless." "When it was over, did you hear any sounds then?" "No." "Can you remember anything else about the men?" "Yeah, one. The one who touched me. Had big brown eyes, sort of watery. There's a word for it, like puppy dog eyes. But these were cruel." "Did they go anywhere else in the house?" "No." "Did you see them take anything at all?" "No." "When your father saw them, how did he seem?" "What do you mean?" "Was he surprised?" "Well, yeah, when they grabbed him." "And after?" I don't know. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, like, resigned." "Do you think he knew why they were there?" "No. How could he?" "I'm sorry, I have to ask. Just one more question, then we'll move on. Okay? Okay. Did your father go quietly, or did they have to force him? No, he simply walked out with them. He didn't say anything. All right. Tell me, how did you get free from the chair? It was a long time after they'd gone. They'd really tied us tight, and I couldn't feel my hands properly. Alison rubbed at her wrists, still ringed by the burn marks. Finally, I tipped my chair over and crawled to the table where Mother's sewing basket was. There were scissors in there. I cut the rope in the end, then untied Mum. But I'm worried about her now. She's not herself. She don't want to eat. There's no need to worry, Alison dear. I'm all right, said a voice from the doorway. Banks turned. Mrs. Rothwell was tall, with short grey hair and angular features. She wore a cable-knit jumper over black slacks. There was something controlled and attention-demanding about her, a kind of reined-in power. Banks also noticed the chunky rings on her fingers, diamond clusters, a large ruby, a broad gold wedding band. He introduced himself, and she inclined her head slightly. Mrs. Rothwell, did your husband have any enemies that you knew of? No, none. But then I really have no idea what kind of people he dealt with. He didn't bore me with the details of his business. But he travelled a lot. Where? Oh, Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol, London sometimes, and Europe. He was much in demand, a brilliant financial analyst. What exactly did that involve? Well, he had a genius for figures. He'd advise people what to do with their money, helped businesses out of difficulties, a troubleshooter if you like, but a very exclusive one. He could pick and choose his clients. And you never met any of his business associates? We did have people for dinner occasionally. We never talked business, though. I see. Banks wished he could have a cigarette in what was obviously a non-smoking household. Now, Mrs. Rothwell, this next question may strike you as rather indelicate, but were there any problems in the family? Of course not. We're a happy family, aren't we, Alison? Yes, Mother. Tell me, had you noticed any changes in your husband recently? Had he been behaving at all unusually? Well, he had been a bit edgy, a bit preoccupied. I mean, he always was quiet, but lately he'd been even more so. For how long? 2 or 3 weeks. He never told you what was wrong? No. What did you talk about over dinner yesterday? Oh, I don't know, the usual. The children, the house extension we wanted done. What do you talk about when you're out with your wife? Good question, Banks thought. It had been so long since he and Sandra had gone out together that he couldn't remember what they talked about. Listen, Chief Inspector, I'm afraid I can't talk any more. I feel a bit faint. Alison? Alison stood up and helped her from the room. Banks looked across to WPC Smithies. Picked anything up from them? Nothing, sir. I think they're both trying to deny what happened. But they're a weird pair. A couple of minutes later, Alison came back. I'm sorry, Mummy's still in shock. Yeah, that's understandable, Alison. I've almost finished, anyway. One last question. Where's your brother? We should get in touch with him. Alison picked up a postcard from the piano and gave it to Banks. It showed the Golden Gate Bridge. Banks flipped it over. Postmarked 2 weeks ago, it read, Dear Ali, love California and San Francisco, great, but it's time to move on. I'm flying to Florida to lie in the sun. Also to check out the Motion Picture Conservatory in Sarasota. More news when I get there. Love to Mum. Tom. How long's he been gone? 6 weeks. He left at the end of March. He's hoping to go to film college in America and become a director. How old is he? 21. Banks stood up. All right, Alison, thank you. WPC Smithies will stay for a while, and I'll ask the doctor to pay your mother another visit. Please, you mustn't worry about us. Banks went out to his car and lit a cigarette. Then, as he drove along the bumpy track to the Relton Road, he slipped a Thelonious Monk tape into the cassette player and thought about Alison and her mother. No matter what they'd said, there was something wrong in that family, and he had a hunch Tom Rothwell might know what it was. The sooner they contacted him, the better. Lawrence Pratt delved into a drawer in his desk and pulled out a bottle of Courvoisier VSOP and 2 glasses. "I'm sorry, I'm not a secret tippler. I keep it for emergencies, and what you've told me definitely constitutes one. You'll join me, Miss Gay, sir. D.C. Gay." Susan saw the inadvertent smile flash across his face. People often did that when she introduced herself. Once, one clever bugger had actually asked, "Did you say AC or DC?" But she comforted herself with the thought that he was now doing a stretch in strange ways. And it occurred to her that Pratt might not be entirely happy about his name. "No, thank you, sir. If we could get back to Mr. Rothwell." "Yes, of course. It's a bit of a shock, because I knew Keith quite well. We worked together here for some years." "And he left 5 years ago?" "Right." "Although he was a partner?" "Yes." "I understand the family used to live in Eastvale." "Yes, a nice house in Catterick Street." "Why move then?" "Oh, Mary always fancied the countryside. I think she wanted to play lady of the manor." "And what about her husband?" "Oh, Keith didn't mind. I imagine he liked the solitude. He wasn't exactly antisocial, but he was never a great mixer. Not lately, anyway. He travelled a lot, too." "Did you ever visit him there?" "Yes, my wife and I dined with him on several occasions." "So why did he leave Hatchard and Pratt?" Pratt looked into his brandy glass, swirling the liquid. "Ambition, maybe? Straightforward accountancy bored him. He was fond of abstractions, very good with figures." "When he left the firm, was there any bad feeling, any problems?" "No, we were sorry to lose him." "He wasn't fired?" "No." "Did he take clients with him?" Pratt shuffled in his chair. "Most firms lose some business whenever a popular member leaves to set up on his own." "Could you provide me with a list of the clients he took?" "I don't see why not." "Thank you. He clearly made a fair bit of money. How did he do that?" "Hard work, good investments, excellent service." "I understand he actually owned a number of businesses." "Yes, he was interested in property development. Keith was an astute businessman." "Did Mrs. Rothwell work?" "Mary? Oh, heavens, no. She has the Women's Institute, the church committees, the good causes. Mary keeps very busy." "Good causes?" "Yes, you know, the RSPCA, NSPCC, cancer and the like. Nothing controversial, of course, no ban the bomb or AIDS research. She was the boss's daughter, after all. She has conservative standards to maintain." "The boss's daughter?" "Oh, yes, didn't you know? Mary was old man Hatchard's daughter. He's dead now, of course." "So Keith Rothwell married the boss's daughter?" "I don't suppose that did his career any harm." "No, but that was more luck than good management. He got her pregnant first, then married her." "And how did that go over?" "Old man Hatchard was mad as hell at first, but even so I think he was glad to get her off his hands. And he could hardly have her married to a mere junior, so Keith pretty quickly became a full partner." Pratt twisted a paperclip. He seemed to be enjoying this, Susan thought. He was toying with her. She sensed that if she didn't ask exactly the right questions, she wouldn't get the answers she needed. The problem was, what were the right questions? "Tell me, sir, can you think of any reason anyone might have for killing Mr. Rothwell?" "No." "When was the last time you spoke to him?" March, I think." "Yes, shortly after St. Patrick's Day. The wife and I went for dinner. Mary loves to show off the house, you know. That time it was the kitchen we had to admire." "I see. What do you know about the son, Tom?" Well, I understand he's in America. Always a cheerful, polite kid. No trouble, then? Not in any real sense, no. His father was a little impatient with him, perhaps. Oh, in what way? Well, he wanted Tom to go into business or the law, something respectable. But Tom's the artsy type. He dropped in briefly that evening, excited about his American trip. Alison stayed in her room, of course. She usually do that? Well, Alison's a sweet child, but bit of a bookworm. Real loner. Very secretive, like her father. Secretive? Pratt swivelled in his chair and gazed out of the window. Yes, I've always felt that about him. Always something in reserve. He turned to face Susan again. Oh, years ago we'd let loose once in a while, get blind drunk and not give a damn. But over time, Keith sort of reined himself in, cut himself off. He became a very private person. I'd no idea what he lived for. Can you explain that? Well, I don't know what really mattered to him. I'm sure he loved his family, but he never spoke much about it. He never talked about hobbies, and I don't know what he did in his spare time. It's as if there were a dimension missing, a man with a hole in the middle. I mean, he was a perfectly nice bloke, wouldn't hurt a fly, but you never knew what his dream was. And for example, mine's a villa in Portugal. But then a dream doesn't have to be a thing, does it? I don't know. Maybe he valued abstractions too much. He paused, as if he had run out of ideas. I see, Susan said. Can we get back to Mr. Rothwell's work with your firm? Is there anything you can tell me about his style, shall we say, his business practices? Well, he certainly had a flair. Very, creative. Does that imply fraudulent? Pratt looked up at her. You want to know if Keith was a crook? Of course not. Oh, come on, Mr. Pratt, in your business you must sail close to the wind at times, and if there was anything unusual in Mr. Rothwell's business dealings it could have a bearing on his murder. Pratt swirled the rest of the brandy and tossed it back. He put the glass in his out tray, no doubt for the secretary to take and wash. So far as I know, he never did anything truly illegal. Certainly nothing that could be relevant to his death. But... Oh, well, I suppose I'd better tell you, hadn't I? You're bound to find out somehow. Bloody hell! Can hardly hear myself thinking here. The Queen's Arms was always busy on a Friday, but through quick reflexes they'd all managed to grab a table by the window. Around them, conversation and laughter ebbed and flowed. Right then, Phil, what have you found? Richmond sipped his St. Clement's. Well, there are several items on Rothwell's computer that have been either encrypted or assigned passwords. Some are complete directories, but one's just a document file he's called Letter. Right, so let's assume he had some special reason for keeping these items secret. Gristhorpe coughed and waved away Banks's smoke with an exaggerated gesture. Can you get access? Well, not easily, no, sir. I've tried every trick and all I've got is gibberish. But there is a way. Well, yes, two, actually. We could bring in an expert, someone who writes the programs. Oh? Well, there's a company in Taunton that sells bypass programs for software security systems, but it's not cheap. How much? About 200 quid. Gristhorpe whistled. Well, we don't have a lot of choice, do we? Go ahead, order one. I already have, sir, but it could take a while to get here. Tell the buggers to send it by courier, then. But Lord knows what the DCC'll say come accounting time. If it helps us solve the case, maybe he'll increase our budget, said Banks. In a pig's arse, he will. Right, Susan, anything from Hatchard and Pratt? Susan leaned forward to make herself heard. Yes, sir. It turns out Rothwell was asked to leave. You mean fired? Not exactly, sir. He was a partner and they didn't want to fuss, so he was asked to resign. He got off lucky. Interesting. What was it all about then? It seems Rothwell was caught padding his timesheets. He was doing work for a large company, Pratt wouldn't tell me who, but old man Pratt was looking over the billings and noticed Rothwell had doubled up on his hours. At times he couldn't have been working on the account because he'd been out of town. Isn't there some regulatory board he should have been reported to? Yes, sir, but he was also married to Hatchard's daughter, with 2 kids. So Hatchard hardly wanted his son-in-law struck off, and it would have put the partnership in an awkward position. I also got the impression that it might have been Mary Rothwell's demands that set him padding his accounts in the first place. I see. Good work, Susan. Gristhorpe rubbed his whiskery chin. Let's make Rothwell's business affairs a major line of inquiry. Alan, anything to add? We need to follow up on the wadding. D.S. Hatchley's coming back from the coast Monday. He'd be good for the job. He spent a while working for the West Yorkshire Vice Squad. Besides, he'd enjoy it. Aye, I suppose. But keep him on a tight leash. He's a bloody bull in a china shop. Banks grinned. He knew Gristhorpe and Jim Hatchley didn't get along. He took a sip of Theakston's. There's something bothering me about the Rothwells, though. Something not quite right about them. I think the son, Tom, might have something to do with it. The sooner we find him, the better. Well, that's up to the Florida police now. We've passed on all the information we've got. But come on, Alan, surely you don't think the family had anything to do with it? I don't know. Tom's postcard from California was addressed to Alison, and he wrote, "Love to Mum." There was no mention of his father. Don't have to mean anything. No, maybe not. But in Rothwell's wallet there were photos of Mary and Alison. None of Tom, though. Not one. Saturday morning was beautiful. Calendar weather. May, as Banks knew it, had finally arrived. The sky was a cloudless blue as he entered the Tudor-fronted station. First, he called in at the murder room to talk to Richmond. The Florida State Police had tracked down the car rental company Tom Rothwell had used at Tampa Airport, so they had a license number to look for. It was a start. Banks poured a coffee and went to his office. The national dailies had carried stories on the killing, sandwiched between a bloodthirsty put-down of riots on a Caribbean island, where another dictator was nearing the end of his reign of terror, and a male member of Parliament caught in flagrante with the 16-year-old rent boy on Clapham Common. On his desk, Banks found Rothwell's post-mortem notes, but there was nothing he hadn't expected. Cause of death was a shotgun wound to the back of the head, and it was lucky they already knew who the victim was, as there wasn't enough connected bone and tissue left to reconstruct the face. Though the tooth fragments could be collected and analysed, it would take a bloody long time. The blood group, O, matched that supplied by Rothwell's doctor, as well as that of half the population. Dr. Hunter had also verified that Rothwell had had his appendix removed just over 3 years before, hence the scar. The stomach contents revealed pasta and red wine, and Dr. Glendenning, the Home Office pathologist, estimated the time of death at between 11 and 1. Banks put down the file as the phone rang. Vic Manson was calling from the forensic lab. Alan, that wadding. What about it? We got some of the paper unfolded. It wasn't too badly burned inside. It's good magazine quality, probably German, and it's not your common or garden girly magazine. The picture on one side seemed to be of a shaved vagina. Apparently some people have a fetish about them. No prints, though. Banks sighed. Anything from the house? No prints. They wore gloves, and there was nothing special about the rope they used to tie the wife and daughter. Oh, by the way, remember the overturned chair was wet? Yes, Alison's chair. Well, the poor lass pissed herself. OK, Vic, thanks. Keep at it. Will do. After he'd hung up, Banks lit a cigarette and walked to the window. He thought of Alison. Someone had scared her so much she'd sat in her own urine, probably for hours. The idea of her indignity and humiliation made him angry. He vowed he would find whoever was responsible and make damn sure they suffered. He stood looking down on the tourists in their bright anoraks, milling about the cobbled square. It was market day in Eastvale, and the canvas-covered stalls looked like the old Wild West wagon trains. The cheese van was there, as usual, and he thought he might nip out and buy a wedge of Wensleydale Blue if he got the chance. So far, he had an impression of Mary Rothwell as a woman who put too much value on appearances, and of Rothwell as sly, greedy, prey to temptation. But did that greed originate in Rothwell himself, or had he felt pushed into it by the demands of an ostentatious, possibly overbearing wife? He'd supplied her with all the luxuries. But what did he have going for himself? He moved away from the window and stubbed out his cigarette as the phone rang again. This time it was Sergeant Rowe at the desk, who put him through to a distraught woman. "Can I help you?" Banks said. "Are you the one in charge?" "It depends. What's it about?" "The man who was killed. It was in the paper this morning." "Go on." "I knew him." "You knew Rothwell?" No, you've got it wrong. That's not his name. It's Robert Calvert." Sandra had asked if she could use the Cortina that morning, so Susan Gay drove him in an unmarked police Fiesta to Leeds. Though the car had no cassette player, it did have a radio, and Banks was able to lose himself in a Poulenc chamber concert on Radio 3 as he considered the implications of what he'd learned. "How are we going to play this, sir?" Susan asked as she crossed the bridge over the River Aire. "By ear." Finally, Susan pulled into a street of terraced back-to-backs, each with a postage-stamp lawn behind a privet hedge. "This is it, sir. 20, 24... Here, sir." She drew up to the curb. Across the street were some allotments behind a low stone wall. Further down there was an old chapel which had been converted into a Sikh temple. They walked down the path of number 28 and rang the doorbell. There was no denying that the woman who opened the door was of exceptional beauty. Northern Indian, Banks guessed, or perhaps from Bangladesh or Pakistan. She had glossy blue-black hair, skin the colour of burnished gold, and a figure that wouldn't be out of place in Playboy. She wore skin-tight, ice-blue jeans and a jade-green T-shirt. She looked to be in her mid-20s. "Pamela Jeffries?" "Yes. Come in." In the living room, a few family photographs stood in gilt frames on the mantelpiece. On the wall above the fireplace hung a print of Ganesh, the elephant god, in bright primitive colours. But what caught Banks's interest most was a music stand with, beside it, on a chair, what he took first to be an oversized violin, but quickly recognised as a viola. "You're a musician, Miss Jeffries?" "Yes, with the Northern Philharmonia." Banks was impressed. The Northern Philharmonia was regarded as one of the best orchestras in the country and played for Opera North. He'd been to see their production of La Bohème, so must have heard her play. He slipped a recent photograph of Keith Rothwell from his briefcase and passed it to her. "Is this the man we're talking about?" "Yes, this is Robert, though he looks a bit stiff here." She handed it back. "Look, there's some mistake, isn't there?" "What exactly is your relationship?" She fiddled with her bead necklace. "We're friends. Maybe more than that at one time." "Lovers?" "For a while." "How long?" 3 or 4 months. "Until when?" 6 months ago. But we remained friends. Robert's fun to be with." "How did you meet?" "In a pub. The Boulevard on Westgate. We got talking." "When did you last see him, Miss Jeffries?" Pamela, please, call me Pamela. Let's see, it must be a month ago. Look, all this in the paper, is it a mistake or what? We don't know yet, love, said Susan. You'll help us best by answering our questions. Pamela nodded. Was there anything unusual about Robert when you last saw him? Anything worrying him? No, Robert never seemed to worry about anything. So there was nothing at all different about him? Well, I wouldn't say that, but, well, it's simply a guess. What is? I think he was in love. He'd met another woman. Banks paused. Keith Rothwell, a dull, dry accountant? With a wife and children in Swainsdale and a beautiful girlfriend like this in Leeds, whom he could simply dump for yet another woman? Listen, did you ever see this woman? No, but a woman knows these things. Tell me, how often did you see each other? When we were going out? Yes. Once, twice a week, and weekends sometimes. He travels a lot. What's his business? Dunno. He never said much about it. I can't say I was really that interested. What kind of things did you do? Where did you go? Out for dinner. Brasserie 44, La Grillade, until it moved. He likes good food. Sometimes, if I wasn't playing, we'd go to concerts at the town hall, though he's not very fond of classical music, to be honest. Prefers jazz. Trad. Then sometimes we'd stay in, order a curry and watch telly, or rent a video, oldies, Casablanca, the Maltese Falcon, that kind of thing. Oh, and once in a while we'd go to Napoleon's. Napoleon's? Yeah, the casino. He loves a flutter, does Robert. He'd go through 100 or more some nights. And a couple of times he took me to the races at Pontefract and Doncaster. That's about it, really. Listen, Chief Inspector, can't you tell me what's going on? It's not the same person that was murdered, is it? It's a case of mistaken identity. I don't know. Maybe he had a double. Did he have an appendix scar? Pamela shrugged. Yes, but so do lots of people. Did he always come here? Didn't you ever go to his hotel? She frowned. Hotel? What hotel? Well, I assumed he stayed at one when he was in town. No, of course not. Robert never stayed at any hotel. He's got a flat in Headingley. The three of them stood in the living room of Robert Calvert's flat. It was in a nice part of Headingley, not the scruffy bit around Hyde Park that was honeycombed with student bedsits. There's this room, a bedroom, a kitchen, and bathroom, said Pamela. It's not big, but it's cosy. It was not the kind of place Mary Rothwell would much care for, Banks thought. Equipped with all the usual stuff, TV, video, stereo, a few trad jazz CDs, it smelled of stale smoke and had a comfortable lived-in feel he'd never sensed at Arkbeck Farm. There was a scratched coffee table with an overflowing ashtray, a worn armchair by a gas fire, and a photograph of a younger-looking Rothwell on the mantelpiece. On the wall hung a print of Monet's Waterloo Bridge, Grey Day. They found the bedroom in a mess. The bed was unmade, and discarded socks, pants, and shirts lay over the floor. On the bedside table was a shaded reading lamp and a copy of The Economist. Carefully, Banks opened the drawer. A packet of condoms lay forlornly next to a passport in the name of Robert Calvert, and a selection of Dutch, French, Greek, and Swiss small change. He saw through the transparent plastic holder inside credit cards, also in the name of Calvert. He turned to Pamela. Okay, you can go home now. We'll have to stay, but we'll pay for a taxi. Sorry we had to ruin your day for you. The Black Sheep in Relton Village was the closest Swainsdale had to a well-kept secret. Most tourists were put off by the pub's shabbiness, and the renowned surliness of the landlord, Larry Grafton, Dales born and bred, kept them away in droves too. But Elsie, Larry's wife, could do you a fry-up so good You could feel your arteries hardening as you ate. When Banks walked in that Sunday lunchtime, the public bar was, as usual, empty, apart from one table of old men playing dominoes and, as Banks had expected, Pat Clifford propping up the bar. He was a hard, stout man with stubble for hair and a rough red face burned by the sun and whipped by the wind and rain for 50 years. "Hello, stranger," he said as Banks stood next to him. "Long time no see." His glass was empty, so Banks asked Larry to pull him another. Then he brought up the subject of Keith Rothwell. "Aye, they only comes when they want summat." But he said it with a smile, and Banks had learned that Yorkshire folk often take the sting out of their criticisms that way. Pat took a couple of sips of beer, then put the glass down on the bar. "Aye, he come in once or twice, did Mr. Rothwell." "How often?" "Oh, once a week, maybe. Sometimes twice. Right, Larry?" The landlord came and stood with them. He still treated Banks with a certain amount of disdain. After all, Banks was a southerner and a copper. "Aye, only at lunch-times like," he said, "and he'd only drink the one half." "Did he talk much?" "Nay," said Pat. "He weren't much of a chatterbox. Bit of a dry stick, if you ask me." "So you didn't really know him?" "No, nobody did." "No," added Larry, "but I reckon as he wanted to get away from that wife of his." "Aye, maybe he was a bit henpecked at that," said Pat. "Working at home when the wife's around all the time, never get a minute's peace. But you should ask Larry's lass, Cathy. She does for Mrs. Rothwell now and again, like." "Aye, that she does." Indeed, Banks thought, it might be worth having a word with Larry's lass, Cathy. "May I see her for a moment, Larry?" "Aye, she's finishing her dinner. I'll send her through." "Thanks." Banks took his drink, went over to the tiled fireplace, and sat looking at the collection of butterflies in a glass case on the wall. A couple of minutes later, Cathy Grafton, a plump girl of about 16 with a fringe and a blotchy complexion, came from the back and joined him. "Dad says you want to see me." She wedged herself into a chair. "Yeah." Banks lit a cigarette. "You help out at Ardbeck Farm, don't you?" "Aye, I do housework for a few folk around here. Mum says we need money." Not surprising, Banks thought, given the way Larry Grafton scared business away. "So, what's it like working there? Like it?" "It's all right." "How about Mrs. Rothwell? Get along with her?" Cathy wouldn't meet his eyes. She shifted in her chair. "Cathy?" "Well, she's a bit bossy. She stands over you with her arms folded, telling you you've missed a bit or you're not polishing hard enough." "And what about Alison?" "Oh, little Miss La-di-da. Always has her nose in a book." "You've never chatted with her?" "No, stuck-up little madam." "Cathy, you know Mr. Rothwell was killed?" "Aye, I know." "How did the family get along with one another?" "Didn't say out much. We were a quiet house. He were usually in his office like, and he didn't like people to go up there." "Have you noticed any changes recently? Have the family behaved any differently?" "Not as I could tell." "What about the son, Tom? You know him?" "Oh, he's the best at lot. Always has a smile for you. But they used to argue." "Who?" "Him and his father. Sometimes you couldn't help but hear, like." "What did they argue about?" "Well, once when door were open a bit, I heard his dad say a name, then something like, 'I'm disappointed in you.' And he said shame, too. I could tell Mr. Rothwell was very angry." "Did he say why he was disappointed?" "No." "And what was the name he mentioned?" "Sounded like Afton, something like that." "And did you hear what Tom said back?" "He said, 'You're a right one to talk about being disappointed in me.'" "Did you hear anything more?" "No." Cathy's chair scraped on the stone flags as she stood up. "Look, I've got to go and help me mum or she'll kill me." and she hurried back behind the bar. Vic Manson's matched prints from the Calvert flat with the ones from Rothwell's body, Gristhorpe said back at the station that afternoon. There were a couple of other sets too, smudged mostly and not on file. So Rothwell really was Calvert. Aye, looks that way. Banks stood by the open window of Gristhorpe's office. I still can't believe it. Rothwell as some sort of playboy. Casinos, races? And you should have seen Pamela Jeffries, the one he chucked over. Bloody hell. Aye, a proper Bobby Dazzler by the sound of her. Well, she dazzled this Bobby anyway. But the question we have to ask ourselves now is what, if anything, does that have to do with his murder? Jealousy? Well, it's possible. Maybe Mary Rothwell found out, arranged a hit. Or this Pamela. Classical musician? Couldn't afford it. Besides, she didn't strike me as the jealous type. Could be lying. I suppose. Anyway, I'll have to talk to her again. Poor you. So, have the fraud squad anything to say? Well, I spent this morning with D.I. Macmillan. Boring little bugger. Used to be in banking. Anyway, they've had a look at the stuff from Arkbeck Farm, and you should have seen his eyes light up. He won't know anything for certain until they manage to open some of those locked computer directories. That's where the really interesting stuff is, he thinks. But even some of the written documents cause him to suspect Rothwell was heavily into money laundering or serious tax evasion. There was apparently a fair bit of cryptic correspondence with foreign banks, Liechtenstein, Antilles, Jersey, Switzerland, the Cayman Islands. Dead giveaway, Macmillan said. Tax havens. Aye, they're havens because they're very, flexible. No questions asked. Aye, that's about it. Banks are basically run on greed, aren't they? Go on. Well, Macmillan thinks Rothwell was probably acting for a third party. He could hardly have made the sums involved himself. So what was in it for him? 4% for laundering the safer sort of funds, up to 10% for seriously dirty money. Percentage of what? Well, according to Macmillan, between 4 and 6 million quid. Conservative estimate. Over how long? No, that's a year, Alan. Jesus. Aye, worth murdering for, isn't it? In addition to his legitimate earnings in the money laundering racket, Rothwell stood to earn, well, let's make it easy, say 5% of 5 million a year. How much is that? £250,000 Aye. No wonder the bugger could afford a BMW and a new kitchen. There was a sharp knock at the door, and Richmond came in, holding a small package. "We got it, sir. The bypass software." They followed him to the computer room, once a cramped cleaning cupboard, and watched while he booted up and consulted the instructions. Then he went through a series of commands. Drive lights flashed, the machine buzzed and hummed. Got it. A locked file called summary.924 came to the screen. "What the hell's that all about?" said Banks, as the list scrolled on. "Financial records, looks like. Last quarter of 92, said Gristhorpe. "Companies, banks, dates, numbered accounts. Keep going, Phil. Try that letter file you mentioned." Richmond highlighted the locked file, tapped at the keyboard again, and the file appeared unscrambled. A letter dated the 1st of May, addressed to a Daniel Clegg, solicitor, of Park Square, Leeds. "Dear Mr. Clegg, in the light of certain information that has come to my attention, I regret that we must terminate our association. Yours faithfully, Keith Rothwell." "That's it?" said Gristhorpe. "That's it, sir." "Interesting," said Banks. "I wonder what information that was, exactly." End of CD 1. CD 2. Park Square is one of the few examples of elegant, late 18th century Leeds still remaining. Very impressive, Banks thought, that fine Monday morning, as he found the right house in the middle of a restored red-brick Georgian terrace. One of several polished brass nameplates beside the door read, Daniel Clegg, solicitor, and told him the office he wanted was on the first floor. He walked up, knocked on the frosted glass door, and found himself in a dim anteroom where a woman sat behind a desk. When he'd entered, he noticed a look of fear flash through her eyes, quickly replaced by one of suspicion. "Yes, could I help you?" She was Banks' guest, about 30, with curly brown hair, a thin olive-complexioned face, and a rather long nose. Despite the heat, she wore a fawn cardigan. Banks showed his card. "Mr. Clegg around?"
"No, he's not here."
"Know when he'll be back?"
"No."
"Know where he is?"
"No."
"What's your name?"
"Betty Moorhead. Mr. Clegg's secretary."
She took a crumpled paper tissue from the sleeve of her cardigan and blew her nose.
"Cold. Got a cold. Can you believe it? In May. What do you want Mr. Clegg for?"
Banks hesitated. "I've some questions about Keith Rothwell."
"Oh, yes. Poor Mr. Rothwell, I read about him. Terrible. He and Mr. Clegg did business together now and then. Only last week he was standing right where you are now."
"Oh? Which day? It could be important." She flipped through a heavy appointments book on her desk.
"Yep, Wednesday, just before I finished at 5.
So, Rothwell had visited Clegg the day before his murder, but 2 weeks after the letter ending their association. So why? It certainly hadn't been noted in his appointment book. How did Mr. Rothwell seem?
No different from usual."
And Mr. Clegg?
"Fine."
No tension between them?
"No."
How did Mr. Clegg react to Mr. Rothwell's death? She paused.
"Well, that's the problem. I don't know. I haven't seen him since last Thursday. He left about 5:30, and that's the last I saw of him. He didn't come in on Friday."
Have you called his home?
"Yes, I got the answering machine, and he usually tells me if he's going away for any length of time."
Do you know what kind of business relationship Mr. Clegg had with Mr. Rothwell?
"No. Mr. Clegg didn't take me into his confidence. Mr. Rothwell was an accountant, and Mr. Clegg specialises in tax law, so I suppose it would be something to do with tax."
Ever heard of a Robert Calvert?
"No."
Sure?
"No. He wasn't a client."
Banks regarded her closely. He didn't think she was lying. "Betty, when I came in, you looked frightened. Why?" She paused again.
"I thought you might be one of them again."
"One of whom?"
"Well, on Saturday morning I was here doing filing, and 2 men came in. They asked questions about Mr. Clegg. They weren't very nice."
"Did they hurt you?"
"Of course not, or I'd have called the police. But they were, well, less than polite. A bit brusque."
"And why were you frightened? Did they threaten you?"
"Not in so many words. But there was a coldness in their eyes. I got the impression they were testing me to see what I knew."
"What did they want to know about?"
"Where Mr. Clegg was."
"That's all?"
"Yes. They said they had important business with him."
"Did they give their names?"
"No.
"What did they look like?"
One was black, the other white. They wore dark suits."
"What about their height?"
"Both about 6 foot, I'd say. The white one was burly, like a wrestler or something. Fair hair, going bald. The black man was thin, fit-looking, more like a runner. He did most of the talking. He sounded educated, and he had a slight foreign accent."
Banks nodded. They clearly didn't match Alison Rothwell's description of the 2 men who'd killed her father.
"There's something else," Betty added. "When I came in this morning, I got the impression that someone had been here."
"Any sign of forced entry?"
"No, nothing obvious like that. Things look the same, but not quite the same, if you know what I mean."
As if someone had messed things up and tried to restore them to how they were originally.
"Yeah."
"And it couldn't have been Mr. Clegg?"
"Well, he does sometimes come in on a Sunday."
Then she shook her head.
"But no, if it had been him, I'd have known. things would have looked different.
Well, Banks thought, the fraud squad too would need to examine the Clegg records and look for whatever the link was between him and Rothwell. "Look, may I use the phone?" Betty nodded. Banks phoned Ken Blackstone at Millgarth and briefly told him the situation. Ken said he'd send a squad car over right away. Next, Banks phoned Gristhorpe to report his findings. Gristhorpe said he'd get the fraud squad to coordinate with West Yorkshire. Then Banks turned back to Betty. "There'll be more police here soon. They'll need you to tell them everything you told me." Betty reached for her tissue again. "What do you think's happened to him?" "Probably nothing, so don't worry." "It's just that Melissa will be upset." "Who's Melissa?" "Oh, you didn't know? That's Mrs. Clegg, his wife." "Yes, I was born here. My mum and dad came over to Shipley to work in the woolen mills in 1952. They even changed their name from Jaffrey to Jeffries because it sounded more English. Can you believe it?" It was 1:30 now, and the hot, smoky pub was packed with clerks and shopkeepers on their lunch break. Banks had phoned Pamela Jeffries before leaving for Leeds, and she'd suggested they meet in the pub across from the hall where she was rehearsing. On the way there, Banks had mulled over Daniel Clegg's disappearance and the mysterious goons Betty Moorhead had seen. Maybe there was no connection with Rothwell's murder, but there were too many coincidences. The letter, the timing, the shady accounts, and Banks didn't like coincidences. Which meant there were two sets of goons on the loose, the ones who killed Rothwell and the ones who scared Clegg's secretary. But did they work for the same person? So, Pamela sipped her grapefruit juice. "What's been happening?" "Plenty." Banks was hoping to avoid the issue of Calvert's identity for as long as possible. "Ever heard of a solicitor called Daniel Clegg?" "No, can't say as I have." "Robert never mentioned him?" "No. Why?" "When you were out together, did you ever meet anyone he knew in a restaurant, say, or the casino?" "No, not that I recall." Banks lit a cigarette. Was she going to ask now, or would he have to bring it up? Maybe she was avoiding the moment too. A group at the next table burst into laughter at a joke one of them had told. Finally she said, "Well, did you find out anything? About Robert and this Rothwell fellow?" Banks could sense the apprehension in her voice. "I'm sorry. The fingerprints matched. It looks as if Calvert and Rothwell were the same person." For a while she said nothing. Then Banks saw her almond eyes fill slowly with tears. "So I've been a right bloody fool, haven't I? Muggins again. Shit." Susan took from her briefcase the blue file cards she liked to make notes on and pinned them to the cork board over her desk. The same board she remembered Sergeant Hatchley had used for his pin-ups of page 3 girls with enormous breasts. And now Hatchley was due back any moment. What a thought. The phone rang and she picked it up. "East Vale CID, Detective Constable Gay." "Is Chief Inspector Banks there?" "I'm afraid not. Can I help?" "Well, I suppose you'll have to do. My name's Mary Rothwell. I've had a call from Tom, my son." "You have? Where is he?" "Still in Florida. Lido Key, wherever that is. Apparently the British newspapers are a couple of days late over there, and he's only now read about his father's murder. So he's flying back, and I'm meeting him at Manchester Airport at 7 tomorrow morning." "You do know we'd like to talk to him?" "Yes, though I can't imagine why. You'll pass the message on?" "Yes." "Good. Oh, I've made funeral arrangements for Wednesday. That is all right, isn't it?" "Of course. And we'll be in touch." Susan hung up and thought what an imperious woman Mary Rothwell was. Probably a real tartar to live with. But could she be a murderess? There was a lot of money involved.
She'd seen Rothwell's solicitor that morning, and according to him, Rothwell had owned or part-owned about 15 businesses, from a shipping company registered in the Bahamas to a dry cleaner's in Wigan, not to mention properties dotted around England, Spain, Portugal, and France. Of course, the solicitor had assured her they were all legitimate, but Susan suspected that some were fronts for Rothwell's illegal activities. So there was money worth killing for. The problem was, though Susan could imagine Mary Rothwell being cold-blooded enough to have her husband disposed of, she imagined her having it done in a neat, sanitary way. Suddenly Susan became aware of a figure standing in the doorway, and she looked up into the smiling face of D.S. Jim Hatchley. So soon, she thought, with a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. "Hello, love." Hatchley lit a cigarette. "Oh, I see you've taken down my pin-ups. Well, we'll have to do something about that." Built in 1964, the Merion Centre on the northern edge of Leeds city centre was one of the first indoor shopping malls in Britain. It has a large supermarket, the Le Phonographique discotheque, a couple of pubs, a flea market, and a number of small speciality shops. Banks found Clegg's wine and spirits easily enough. He'd phoned Melissa Clegg earlier, but oddly, Banks thought, she hadn't seemed overly curious about details. He opened the door to find himself in a small area cluttered with bottles and cases. He looked at the racks and thought he might take something home for dinner, assuming he and Sandra ever got the chance to sit down to dinner together again. "Can I help you, sir?" The spotty young man behind the counter smiled. His hair had so much gel on it, it looked like an oil slick. Banks showed his card. "Boss around?" "In the back." He lifted up the counter flap, and Banks went through. Manoeuvring around wine cases, he went along a narrow corridor to a tiny office. A woman sat at the desk, talking on the phone. It seemed she was complaining about the non-delivery of some Hungarian Pinot Noir. Finally, she put the phone down and rolled her eyes. Suppliers. About 40, Banks guessed. She had straight blonde hair, parted in the middle, and was wearing a yellow sundress. A pair of no-nonsense glasses with tortoiseshell frames dangled on a cord around her neck. She leaned back in her chair and linked her hands behind her head. "So, what's Danny boy been up to now?" "I'm sorry? Didn't Betty tell you?" "Tell me what?" "Oh, God, that woman, Gormless. Danny and I have been separated for 2 years now, so you're probably on a wild goose chase." "Do you still see one another?" "From time to time." "When last?" "Couple of months ago." "How did he seem?" "Fine. Look, what's all this interest in Danny all of a sudden? First those clients of his, now you." "Clients?" "Yes, Saturday afternoon, a couple of businessmen wanting to know where he was." "They knew you were separated?" "Yes, but they said they'd had an appointment with him that morning and he hadn't shown." "What did they look like?" She described the same men who'd visited Betty Moorhead. "Look, is something wrong?" "We don't know, but he's gone missing." "Oh, is that all?" Banks frowned. His secretary seemed worried. "Oh, Betty's a bit of an alarmist. Danny always did have an eye for the ladies. That's why we're no longer together. Probably he's popped off to Paris for the weekend with some floozy. Danny's such a romantic." "Mrs. Clegg, we think your husband may have been mixed up in some shady dealings." "Oh, well, that hardly surprises me. Danny was never one of the most ethical of people." "Was he the type to get mixed up in something illegal?" "Yes, I think so, if the returns were high enough." "Did you know Keith Rothwell?" "Yes, poor man, I'd met him. I'd bump into him at the office now and then." "You're not suggesting there's a link between his murder and Danny's disappearance, are you?" "We don't know. Have you any idea what kind of business dealings they were involved in?" "No, sorry. I haven't seen Keith since Danny and I split." "Ever heard of a Robert Calvert?" "No. Should I have? Look, I'm sorry I can't help you, but knowing Danny, he'll turn up." "I hope you're right." Banks gave her his card. "Please, if he gets in touch, let us know. Oh, one more thing. Yes? Could you recommend a decent claret for dinner, not too pricey? Of course. But if you're not absolutely stuck on Bordeaux, try a Château de la Liquière. It's a Fougère from the Languedoc. Lots of character. And you can even afford it on a policeman's salary. Banks walked outside with his bottle. Well, not an entirely wasted visit, he thought. Then he felt a large hand clamp his shoulder. "Well, if it ain't me old mate Banksy," said a voice in his ear. "I hope you haven't been accepting bribes." He spun around, and behind him stood Detective Superintendent Richard Dirty Dick Burgess of Scotland Yard. What the hell was he doing here? Burgess put his arm around Banks's shoulders. "Come on, son. We need a little chat." They walked to a pub in the hedgerow, where Burgess ordered McEwen's lager and Banks a pint of bitter. It wasn't Theakston's, but it would have to do. They took their drinks to a table outside as the buses roared by. Banks felt puzzled and apprehensive. The last time he and Burgess had locked horns was over the killing of a policeman at a demo back in the Thatcher era, and Burgess, the son of an East End barrow boy, worked for a department that was not quite Special Branch, not quite MI5, but close enough to both to give him the willies. Burgess lit one of his Tom Thumb cigars. He was still in good shape, though filling out a bit, and his black, slicked-back hair was turning silver at the temples. "I called your station, Banks, and Superintendent Gristhorpe told me where you were. I missed you at the solicitor's office, but Clegg's secretary told me you were coming here." Banks reached for his pint. "And to what do I owe the honour?" He'd never dignified Burgess with a sir. "Ever heard of a place called St. Corona?" "Of course. Caribbean island. Been in the news a bit lately." "That's the one. 7,000 square miles in area, population 4.8 million, chief resources, bauxite, aluminium, sugarcane. Know who the president is?" "What is this, bloody mastermind? Martin Churchill. I've read about him." "Right, president for life. Only the poor sod's a bit beleaguered these days, what with the opposition party raking up the muck and liberation movements going from strength to strength. Because he's been bleeding the country dry for years. What am I supposed to do, cry?" "Still the limp-wristed bloody pinko, eh, Banks? But whatever you or I might think about it, the powers that be decided it was good to have a stable government in that part of the world, someone we could trust. So, Britain, France, Canada, the States have pumped millions into St. Corona over the years. But now Churchill's finished. It's only a matter of weeks. He knows it and we know it. The only thing now is for him to get out alive while he still can." "And he wants to come here?" "Well, not the north of England specifically, but maybe a nice little villa in Devon or Cornwall where the weather's nice. The Yanks have already said no, the French are dithering, and the Canadians are just too fucking moral for their own good. Bottom line is there's a lot of pressure on us to take him in, as quietly as possible, of course." "Sneak him in the back door, you mean?" "If you like." But his human rights record's appalling. Oh dear, been reading The Guardian again, have we? And others, the story's the same. Well, anyway, and this is classified, by the way, there are some people in government who feel we owe him. Oh, come off it. If they want him here, it's not out of any sense of duty. It's because he's got something they want, or because he's got something on them. Cynic. But you're right, he's not a nice man. As far as I can gather, he's a low-life scumbag, a glutton, a murderer, and a rapist, sodomy preferred. But the problem is we made him what he is. Eton, then Cambridge, where he read law. So we educated him alongside a lot of important people, cabinet ministers, bankers, backroom boys. And you know how people can behave indiscreetly when they're young, do things they wouldn't want to come back later to haunt them. In addition, rumour has it he also has a nice little savings account that won't harm our economy one bit. Let me guess, laundered money? Well, of course. Which brings me to the Rothwell murder. Your senior field investigator. Yes? Yes. And that's why I thought, oh, fuck. Because you're a bloody bolshy troublemaker. Thanks for the compliment. Even so, I'm going to trust you with something very important and very, very secret. We've been keeping an eye on the St. Corona situation, and anything to do with Churchill gets flagged. Now, yesterday we got a report from your fraud squad. They found something on Rothwell's computer that indicates he may have been laundering money for Churchill. Now, we knew this was going on, but until now we hadn't a clue who was doing it, and if we're right, we're talking a lot of money. Something like 30 or 40 million over 3 years, mostly aid money provided by Western governments. And you think this might tie up with his murder? Oh, I don't know, but the odds are there's a connection. Considering how he was killed, it was hardly a domestic, was it? Possibly. Do you have any leads on the killers? No, I'm only suggesting Churchill might be behind them. And if he is, then watch your back. Banks thought about that for a moment. And what's Clegg's connection? Well, we don't know yet, or even if there is one. I only just found out about his disappearance. 2 other men have been looking for him too, one black, one white. They your lot? Nah, nothing to do with me. Know anything about them? Nah. He was lying. Banks was certain. So what do you want me to do? Nothing. Carry on as normal. I simply wanted to warn you to tread carefully. Things might be more complicated than they appear on the surface, and there's help available if you want it, of course. Burgess looked at his watch. Good Lord, is that the time? He knocked back his pint, winked, and stood up. See ya. Then he strutted off towards Park Row. Banks lit a cigarette. He didn't trust Burgess as far as he could throw him, and was convinced the bastard was up to something. At a guess, he wanted to get to the killers first so he could hush them up. The last thing the government would want was a big story splashed all over the press about Churchill hiring assassins to murder a Yorkshire accountant. Churchill might be up to worse things on St. Corona, but this was England after all. Tom Rothwell resembled his father more than his mother, Banks thought, sitting opposite him in the living room at Arkbeck Farm the following morning. Though his hair was darker and longer, he had the same thin, oval face and grey eyes. His sulky mouth, though, owed more to early Elvis. It wasn't hard to guess why a plain girl like Cathy Grafton would value a smile from a handsome lad like this. But Banks sensed an aura of arrogance about him, that mix of vanity and overconfidence that he'd often encountered in the wealthy. And he wished, too, that Alison and Mary Rothwell weren't flanking him on the sofa. "Any problems getting a flight?" he asked, as Susan sat in the background taking notes. "No, but I had to change at some dreary place in Carolina and again in New York." "Then you must be tired, and upset about your father, too." "Naturally. We wanted to talk to you because we hoped you might tell us something that could lead us to his killers." "How could I? I've been out of the country since March." "It's possible the roots of the crime lie farther back than that. All the evidence points to his having been involved in something illegal." "Absurd," spat Mary Rothwell. "Keith was an honest businessman, a good person." "Mrs. Rothwell, I'm trying to talk to your son." Mary Rothwell glared at him, lips pressed tight. More than once, Banks had thought of telling her about her husband's other existence as Calvert, but Gristhorpe wanted it kept from the press and family if possible, at least until they developed a few more leads. He turned back to Tom. "Were you close to your father?" "Close enough. He wasn't an emotional sort of person." "You were on good terms?" "Of course." "Did he ever mention Martin Churchill?" "Churchill? No." "You know who he is? Chap in the Caribbean?" "Yes." "Are you serious?" "Where did you travel in America?" "All over. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Miami." "You didn't visit the Caribbean, St. Corona?" "No." "Did your father ever talk to you about his business?" "No." "Ever meet any of his associates?" "Only if they came to dinner, and even then I wasn't generally invited, so I usually found something else to do." Then Tom glanced at Susan, and Banks sensed a softening in his expression. He seemed interested in her presence, curious about her. Time to push a little harder, Banks thought. I gather you had a falling out over your career choice. Your father wanted you to become an accountant or lawyer, but thought you preferred to be an idle, shiftless sod. How dare you? Mary Rothwell jumped to her feet. It's all right, Mother, sit down. It's part of their game. They say things like that to needle you into saying something you'll regret. Mary Rothwell sat again, slowly. Alison glanced up from her book. Banks saw it was Villette. And what is it I might needle you into regretting, you said? Oh, it was only a figure of speech. But you did have such an argument. Sure. Dad wanted me to follow in his footsteps, but I want to be a movie director. He weren't big on the arts, weren't Dad? Banks paused. When the silence had made Tom restless, he went on. Before you went away, you had an argument with your father in which he expressed great disappointment in you. I know now why that is, but you also expressed disappointment in him. Why? I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, come on, you can do better than that. Now Tom looked at Susan again, and Banks noticed a plea for help in his eyes. He looked left and right for support too, but his mother seemed lost in thought, and Alison was still deep in her Bronte. Why were you disappointed in your father, Tom? Tom reddened. I wasn't. Did you find out something incriminating about his business dealings? Is that what you think? What was he up to, Tom? Nothing. I don't know. You're way off beam. Does the name Aston or Afton mean anything? Banks was sure he saw a flicker of recognition. Recognition and fear. No, never heard of him. Banks decided to leave it for now, let Tom stew over whatever it was that confused him. Plenty of time. It was a gorgeous morning in the Dale. The lush fields were full of buttercups. And as he drove through Fortford, Banks put a Bill Evans tape in the player. So, what do you think? He's lying, sir, said Susan. Obviously, but what about? I think it might be a good idea if you talk to him alone next time. Maybe I'll catch him after the funeral. Thinking of going? Oh, I quite like funerals, sir. Rather you than me. Can't stand them. Anyway, see if you can take young Tom aside. Did you see the way he kept looking at you? Yeah. You think he fancies you? Susan paused. No. Somehow, sir, I don't think it was that. In the Queen's Arms, Banks swilled down a mouthful of Theakston's, then lit a cigarette. Gristhorpe sat opposite him, cradling a half-pint. So, lad, according to Burgess, Rothwell was laundering money for Churchill. Looks like. Aye, but we can't assume it was the Churchill link that got him killed. He could have been into something else dirty too. I agree. One interesting thing, Inspector Macmillan tells me that Daniel Clegg acted as Robert Calvert's reference for his bank account and credit card in Leeds. The account has about 20,000 in it. Play money. Aye, and I wouldn't mind that much to play with myself. Anyway, let's try this for size. For the moment, we'll leave Calvert out of it as, say, a personal aberration on Rothwell's part. A red herring, right? OK. So, let's assume Rothwell and Clegg are in it together, money laundering for Churchill or whoever. Makes sense, with Clegg being a tax specialist. OK. Something goes wrong. Rothwell wants out, so he writes to Clegg, ending their association. And Churchill, or whoever they're working for, doesn't like this at all. Makes sense, doesn't it? Keep going. Well, assume Rothwell's got scared. Say he's been cheating on his masters and they've found out, or they're afraid he's getting nervous and is going to blow the whistle. So his masters want him dead. They've got money and needn't get their own hands dirty. What do? Take out a contract. Right. End of Rothwell. Gristhorpe paused. Which brings us to Clegg. The killers knew where Rothwell lived, the layout, everything.
They knew about their wedding anniversary. They knew Rothwell had a daughter too, but she wasn't part of the deal. Clegg could probably have told them all that. So you think Clegg was involved not only in the laundering, but in the murder too? Aye. It's a theory, isn't it? He could be our link. And his disappearance? Scarpered. Don't matter whether he was scared of us or them, he took his money and ran. And when his bosses couldn't contact him, they sent their 2 goons to find him. The timing's right. Or what about this scenario? Churchill had Clegg killed too. With Rothwell gone, he knew too much, was a loose cannon. If Churchill's planning on coming here, maybe he wanted a clean break. Gristhorpe sipped his beer. Possible. You know what has struck me? Do we know if Clegg ever practiced criminal law? Not as far as we know. So where would Clegg meet a killer for hire? Local Conservative club, probably. Aye, but I see what you mean. It's a loose end. And what if Clegg is dead? Nothing changes. West Yorkshire keep looking for a body and we keep asking questions. Look, Alan, I'd better be off. I have a meeting with the Chief Constable. OK, I'll be over soon. Gristhorpe nodded and left. But within minutes he poked his head around the door again. They think they've found the killer's car, abandoned in Leeds. Ken Blackstone says, do you want to have a look? Banks sighed. So, all roads lead to Leeds. Might as well bloody move there. A tape of Satie piano music kept Banks calm on the way to Leeds, though the A1 was busy with juggernauts and commercial travellers driving too fast. He found the car park, an old school playground surrounded by the rubble of demolished buildings, without too much difficulty. Cheers, Alan, said Blackstone. How's it going? Can't complain. How's West Yorkshire CID? Overworked, as usual. It's a bugger. They walked across the tarmac to the abandoned car. Ancient, but not old enough to attract attention, the light blue Escort was guarded by 2 uniformed constables. It matched the description as far as it went. How long's it been here? Don't know. Our lads didn't notice it until last night. When they ran the number, they found it was stolen. Banks looked through the grimy window. The upholstery was dirty, cracked, and split. A McDonald's coffee cup lay crushed on the driver's side. There's nothing in the boot, not even a spare tyre, but I've arranged for it to be taken in for forensics. Thanks, but if they were pros, I don't expect any prints. Who's the lucky owner? Bloke called Ronald Hamilton, unemployed labourer. When did he report it missing? Friday morning. Said he left it in the street on the Rainville estate in Bramley and was gone by next morning. Ring any bells? Banks shook his head. Most likely the killers had picked it at random a good distance from where they lived. Have you talked to this Hamilton? Yes, he knows nothing, believe me. Question the neighbours? Well, we're doing a house-to-house, nothing so far. Nobody sees anything on these estates. So that's that. Looks like it, for now anyway. I could use a break on this one, Ken. Aye, well, we'll give it our best. Hey up, here's the lads to pick the car up. Banks watched as the police tow team tied a line to the Escort. Well, I'd better be off. What are your plans? Oh, there are people I want to talk to again, so for tonight at least I'm checking into the Holiday Inn. Bit posh for a humble copper. Yeah, they'll probably sack me when they see my expenses. Look, Alan, I'd like to invite you over for some home cooking, but Connie left a couple of months ago. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Yeah, well, happens, right? Comes with the territory. She said we were living such separate lives we might as well make it official. Anyway, there's a decent Indian in Eastgate, if you fancy it, the Shabab. About 6:30, 7. Right, you're on. Make it 7. Oh, and Alan, Blackstone said as Banks walked away, you watch yourself. Hotels give married men strange ideas sometimes. Know what I mean? And Banks felt guilty as an image of Pamela Jeffries flashed unbidden through his mind.
Susan Gay heard Hatchley burp before she'd even opened the office door. She felt apprehension churn in her stomach. She couldn't work with Hatchley. She just couldn't. Hatchley was sitting with his feet on the desk, smoking. The small, stifling room stank of stale beer and pickled onions. By God, he's repulsive, Susan thought. A prop forward gone to fat. And then there was his face, brick-red complexion, white eyelashes, and piggy eyes, straw hair thinning on top, fleshy lips, tobacco-stained teeth. He swung his legs to the floor. "Ah, Susan, love, about that wadding." "Yes, sir." "Shaved pussy, smooth as a baby's bottom." "Yes, sir." Susan felt herself blush and hated herself for it. Hatchley smiled. He seemed to be enjoying himself. "Now, it's not a lot to go on, but at least we know it's not kiddie porn or the Bum Brigade, and it's definitely under-the-counter stuff." "Sir, can you get to the point?" "Hold your horses, lass. My point is, shaved pussies aren't exactly 10 a penny, though if we'd found something really kinky, it would have made our job easier. I mean, there aren't many people selling pictures of Rottweilers bonking 13-year-old girls that we don't know about." "I still don't see what you're getting at, sir." Susan should have known Hatchley would be an expert on pornography. "Well, shaved pussy is something of a specialist taste, and there's a fair chance our magazine was bought under the counter somewhere. Now, if we're assuming these lads were local at all, odds are they're from the city, Leeds, Bradford, Manchester, Newcastle or Liverpool at a stretch. But if the boss thinks this Clegg fella was involved, then Leeds is as good a choice as any, agreed?" "Yes, the daughter, Alison, thought one of the men had a Leeds accent, and it looks like they've found the car used for the job there." "Right. Well, a few years back I did a stint on Vice with West Yorkshire. I remember a few purveyors of this kind of porn, if they're still around, that is. Now, I'm not talking sex shops, they'll have been checked already. No, I mean regular newsagents that sell a bit of imported stuff from under the counter, along with their women's weeklies and gardening magazines. So, what I propose is that you and me go to Leeds tomorrow and ask a few questions of our own. You game?" "It's a hell of a long shot." "Nothing ventured, nothing gained, lass." Susan thought for a moment. He made sense, all right. "All right. Good." Hatchley beamed, rubbing his hands together. "I'll arrange permission from the super." "Oh, my God," thought Susan. "What have I let myself in for? A porn hunt with Hatchley." Banks found himself thinking again about Pamela Jeffrey's golden body, her bright personality, her passion for music. After leaving Blackstone, he'd phoned her at home, half hoping she might be free for a drink that evening, but he'd only got her answering machine. She was probably playing, but he'd left a message anyway, telling her where he was staying. On the way to the hotel, he'd picked up a half bottle of Bell's. It would be cheaper than using the minibar in his room. Now, as he checked in, he remembered Blackstone's warning. Was he letting himself get a bit carried away? Would he do anything if he had the chance? If she agreed to come back to his hotel for a nightcap, would he try to seduce her? He didn't know. He went straight up to his room, took off his shoes, and flopped on the bed. It was after 5 now, and he was tired. And he didn't like the feeling of impotence this case was beginning to engender. He decided to phone Sandra, but she wasn't in. Then he called the Eastvale station again and spoke to Susan. Nothing new, except she sounded depressed. He felt much better, though, after a brisk shower. He poured himself a scotch and put on the local television news. He was only giving it half his attention, however, while he dried off and dressed, until suddenly he saw a house he recognized. He heard the reporter say, "When she failed to report for rehearsals today." It was Pamela Jeffrey's house, and outside it stood 2 patrol cars and an ambulance. Banks stood on the threshold of the living room. Whatever had happened there had been extremely violent. The glass coffee table had been smashed in 2, the furniture had been slashed, and the stuffing ripped out. Torn books lay everywhere. Pamela's music stand lay on its side with the splintered pieces and broken bow of her viola beside it. Even the print of Ganesh over the fireplace had been taken from its frame and torn up. Worst of all was the broad, dark blood stain on the cream carpet. "Who the hell are you, Press?" Banks turned to face the plainclothes man coming out of the wreckage of the kitchen. "Look, you bloody know you're not allowed in, so go on, bugger off." "Hang on." He showed his card. "Oh, sorry, sir. D.S. Waltham." "What happened to Pamela Jeffries?" "You know her. What happened? Is she still alive?" "Only just, sir. Someone really worked her over. Broken ribs, broken nose, broken fingers and broken leg. Multiple lacerations, in fact, multiple everything. Doc says no sign of sexual assault, though. She was in a coma when we found her. He thought she was dead." Banks felt a wave of anger surge through his stomach. "When did this happen?" "We think last night. We're interviewing the neighbours." "So she lay there nearly 24 hours? "Could be, sir." "Who found her?" "Her musician colleagues got worried when she didn't show for rehearsals. Apparently she's really reliable and had never missed a whole day before, so one of them drove by after work and knocked on the door. No answer. So he had to butcher's through the window, and after that he phoned us." Banks said nothing. Is there something we should know, sir? What with your showing up here?" "Yes, probably quite a lot." Shit. He looked at his watch. Almost 7. "Look, Sergeant, you know D.I. Blackstone?" "Yes, sir." "Can you get someone to page him? He'll be at the Shabab in Eastgate." "I know it, sir." Waltham went outside, spoke to a uniform for a few moments, then came back. "He's on his way, sir. Look, O'Brien out there tells me there's an old geezer across the street thinks he might have seen something. You want to come?" "Yes, very much." He followed Waltham down the path. Neighbours were standing on their doorsteps in silence, arms folded, faces grim. A small crowd had also gathered on the steps of the Sikh temple down the street. P.C. O'Brien was by the low stone allotment wall, talking to a thin old man wearing a grubby collarless shirt. Behind them there were other allotment workers, some leaning on shovels or rakes. Very Yorkshire Gothic, Banks thought. "Mr. Judd, sir," said O'Brien. "He was here last night, just before dark." Waltham nodded, and O'Brien walked off. Banks sat on the wall and offered his cigarettes around. Only Judd accepted one. "Right, might as well, lad. Too late to worry now." "What time were you out here till?" Waltham asked. "About 9:30. We're getting dark, and all the others had gone home." "So, tell us what you saw." "Aye, well, this car pulled up outside Miss Jeffries' house. Black and shiny, it were." "What make?" "Nay, lad, I wouldn't know that. Weren't big, though." "OK, go on." "Well, 2 men gets out and walks up the path. I noticed one of them were a darkie, but I thought nothing of it. They were both wearing suits, and they looked like them Jehovah's Witnesses." "And did you see them leave?" "No, I'd gone home by then. So that's it, really. I wish I could be of more help." "No, you did fine," said Banks. Ken Blackstone swallowed a mouthful of chicken boona. "Not bad. Not exactly the Shabab, but not bad." This was a Yorkshire compliment. He and Banks were now in an Indian restaurant near Pamela Jeffries' house. In the time they'd been there, Banks had explained what was going on, insofar as he understood it himself. "So, why beat up the girl?" "Well, they must have thought she knew where Clegg was, or that she was hiding something for him. They ripped her place up pretty thoroughly." "And you think they're working for Martin Churchill?" "I reckon Burgess thinks so." "The same two as visited Clegg's secretary and ex-wife?" "I'm certain of it." "But they didn't beat them up?" "Or maybe they were getting desperate. By the time they got to Pamela, they'd found nothing so far. Maybe their boss told them to push harder. I don't know." Banks felt a sudden rage. He couldn't banish the image of Pamela's terror, her agony. Would her broken fingers ever heal enough for her to play again? There is another explanation, you know. What? That she did know something. That she was involved in whatever scam Clegg and Rothwell had going. Banks shook his head. Nah, just doesn't fit. Carefully he piled some goat vindaloo onto a scrap of chapati. Pamela only knew Robert Calvert, remember. She'd never heard of Rothwell until after his murder when his photo appeared in the papers. And she called us. She needn't have done that. So we might never even have heard of Calvert if it weren't for her. And until we find out differently, we must assume Calvert was a persona invented by Rothwell solely for pleasure. I sometimes think I could do with one of those myself. Banks laughed. And Pamela wasn't his only conquest, you know. No doubt there were others before her, and recently she'd become convinced he'd met someone else, someone he'd really fallen for. That would upset the apple cart, wouldn't it? Banks stopped chewing and frowned. Alan? You all right? What? Oh, yeah. It was something I'd never thought of before. He took a swig of watery lager. That's okay. Doesn't matter. Clegg was a bit of a ladies' man too, you know. Anyway, according to my D.C. Gateskill, who's been asking around, lately he's been seeing a receptionist from Norwich Insurance, name of Marcy Lapwing, can you believe? Bit of a bimbo. The Saturday before Clegg's disappearance, they went to a nightclub in Hare Hills. Sunday he took her home, and she hasn't heard from him since. She telling the truth? Gateskill thinks so. Okay. Thanks, Ken. And according to him, Clegg used to eat at a little trattoria on the Hedgerow after work on Thursdays, and the waiters there remember him last Thursday, all right. He left about 6:30, heading towards where his car was parked, back of the court centre. That's the last sighting we have. What kind of car? Red Jag. Gone, of course. But we put it out over the PNC along with this. Blackstone took a photograph from his briefcase and slid it over the tablecloth. It showed a man in his 40s with fair hair, blue eyes, and a slightly crooked nose. So this is Clegg? Blackstone nodded. We've also been through his house in Chapel Allerton. Nothing. Whatever he was up to, he kept it at the office. Anyway, back to what we were saying before. If she wasn't involved, how did the goons know about Jeffries? Banks felt his anger flare up again. Easy. I think they started at Clegg's office first thing yesterday morning, spotted me, and stayed on my tail. They didn't know who the hell I was, and the only person I met that they hadn't talked to already was Pamela. So they must have thought we were all in it together, and one of them at least must have hung around to follow her home. If she'd some connection with Clegg, she looked their best lead so far. Obviously Clegg's got something they want, money most likely. If he was laundering for their boss, he may have skipped with a bundle. Or else he's got some sort of evidence for blackmail, books, bank account records. Banks finished his meal and tapped out a cigarette, but he had to ask the waiter for an ashtray. It was getting like that these days. He lit the cigarette. You know what really pisses me off, though, Ken? Bloody Burgess was following me around too, so it wouldn't surprise me if he'd seen them outside Melissa Clegg's shop. You sure he knows who they are? Oh, he knows, all right. He knows. Back at the hotel, Banks's anger still burned inside him. Somehow he felt responsible for Pamela Jeffries' injuries. He poured himself a shot of Bell's and turned to the television. An old Dirty Harry movie was on. He'd never much enjoyed cop films, but right here and now he could identify with Harry Callahan. He'd like to have Pamela's attackers alone in a quiet cell. Then they'd know what police brutality was all about. He picked up the phone, dialed the code for Eastvale, but then put it down. He didn't think he could explain his feelings to Sandra right now, especially given the way they'd been drifting apart lately. Instead, he phoned the hospital, and after a bit of rank pulling, got a doctor on the line. Miss Jeffries was stable, but still in intensive care. No, she was still unconscious. No, there was no way of telling yet if there was any permanent damage. Banks didn't feel any better when he hung up. At 9 next morning, Susan Gay sat alone in the back pew of the small, non-denominational chapel at Eastvale Crematorium. It was cool inside and smelled of shoe polish,
rather than the musty hymn books she usually associated with chapels. The service went briskly enough. The renter-vicar spoke about Keith Rothwell's devotion to his family and his dedication to hard work. Then, after he'd read a bit from Revelation about a new heaven, a new earth, and all sorrow, pain, and death disappearing, it was over. Susan watched the Rothwells, all in shades of black, walk stiffly out into the sunlight. Nobody reached for a handkerchief. There was not a tear in sight. Mary Rothwell was doing her stiff upper lip routine, bearing her grief with dignity. And everyone ignored Susan, except Tom, who approached her. What are you doing here? You're the detective who was at our house, aren't you? Yes, D.C. Gay. I'd like a word if you can spare a few minutes. Tom took a silver pocket watch from his waistcoat. It seemed a very affected gesture in one so young. All right, but not right now. Everyone's going back to Mr. Pratt's for coffee. I'll have to show. Of course. In an hour? Okay. Look, it's a fine morning. How about that cafe by the river? The one near the pre-Roman site? Okay, I know it. The River Swain was flowing swiftly, still high after the spring thaw. They sat outside at a rickety white table on the grass by the bank. So, how was it? Tom shrugged. I hate those kinds of gatherings, and Lawrence Pratt gets on my nerves. Susan let the silence stretch as Tom looked across the river to the rolling farmland beyond. You know, don't you? You can tell. That you're homosexual. Is it that obvious? Well, maybe not to everyone, but I don't know. Women can often tell when something's wrong. No. Different, then. That'll do. Look, I'm not judging you. It's none of my business unless it connects somehow with the murder. I can't see how. Tell me about this Aston or Afton, then. When DCI Banks mentioned the name, you assumed it was a man. Why? Because I know damn well who he is. Clive bloody Ashton. And he is? The son of one of my father's clients. We were at a party together. I made a mistake. You made advances? Yeah. And they weren't welcome. Obviously. He told his father, who told mine. And my father told me I was a disgusting, sick queer, and that I should get myself cured. He said it would kill Mum if she ever found out. So, did he suggest you take off to America for a while? Yeah, but that came later. First, we let it lie while we figured out what was best. And what did you do in the meantime? Tom watched a family of ducks drift by on the Swain. I followed him. Why? Because I thought he was up to something. He was away so often, and always so remote when he was at home, like he wasn't really with us. He hadn't always been like that. No, believe it or not, Dad used to have a bit of life about him. Oh, sorry. Bad joke. How long had he been behaving this way? A couple of years. It was getting worse. So, because you thought he was up to something, you followed him. I wanted to find out what his guilty secret was. And did you? Yeah. I saw him with another woman. When? February sometime. Where? Leeds. They were holding hands in the Guildford, a pub on the Hedgerow. Do you know what that feels like? Seeing your old man with another woman. Like a kick in the balls. Did your father see you? No. They only had eyes for each other. What happened? Nothing. I left. Tell me, was the woman dark-skinned, Indian or Pakistani? Tom looked surprised. No. Susan took her notepad out. What did she look like then? Much younger than him. Mid-20s, and extraordinarily good-looking. She had kind of reddish-blonde hair. It was piled and twisted on top with some falling loose over her shoulders. You know, kind of messy but ordered. Susan nodded. Hairstyles like that cost a fortune. And she had very fine, pale skin, a flawless complexion, and high cheekbones, straight nose. Look, Tom, I think we'd like to talk to this woman. Could you work with a police artist on this? Your description might help us to find her. Tom nodded. No problem. Good. We'll arrange something. Tell me, did you ever challenge your father about what you saw? No. I came close once when he kept going on about how disappointed he was in me. I told him I was disappointed in him too, but I didn't say why. Does your mother know? No, I'm sure she don't. You think she suspects? Maybe. Who knows? She lives in a bit of a dream world. Sometimes I get the feeling that underneath all the lies she knows the truth, but simply won't admit it to herself. He stood up. Look, I'd better be going. Mum and Alison need my support. Yes. We'll be in touch about the artist then. OK. Susan watched him go down the path, hands in pockets, shoulders slumped. Then she headed off to meet Hatchley. The pawn hunt awaited. At the same time Susan was talking to Tom Rothwell, Banks had a meeting with Melissa Clegg in the coffee bar on the second level of the Merion Centre. She told him on the phone that she had a very busy day planned, but could allow him a little time. So, what can I do for you this time, Chief Inspector? She said. I don't suppose you've heard anything from your husband? Nope. But then he's hardly likely to get in touch with me. It's over. Has he ever mentioned a woman called Marcy Lapwing to you? No. God, what a name. Who's she, the girlfriend? Someone he's been seeing. Well, he's probably run off with this bimbo. No, she's still around. Never mind, let's move on. Banks paused, lit a cigarette, and lowered his voice. Since we last talked, things have taken several turns for the worse. We're talking very serious matters. It looks as if your husband may be implicated in murder, money laundering, theft, and fraud. My God. I assume you're talking about Keith Rothwell's murder. Yeah. The way it looks, both Rothwell and your husband were laundering money for a Mr. X. We know his identity, we think, but I can't reveal it. It's possible Mr. X asked your husband to get rid of Rothwell. No, I don't believe that. Danny couldn't kill anyone. Mrs. Clegg, maybe his own life was threatened. We don't know. We can only speculate. But after he arranged to get rid of Rothwell, he either became a threat himself or he made off with a lot of illegal money, so Mr. X sent 2 goons to track him down. Well, that explains the 2 men who came to see me. Yes. Banks leaned forward and rested his arms on the table. Now, 2 things. First, as you pointed out, your husband was unlikely to have committed the murder personally. So, when you lived with him, did you ever come across any acquaintances, say, or clients of his, whom you'd describe as shady? Oh, a tax lawyer has plenty of shady clients. That's what keeps him in business. But I assume you mean something other than that. Yes, he might have known someone who would consider the job, someone perhaps he met through his practice. No, nobody springs to mind, but I'll think about it. Okay. Banks gave her Alison Rothwell's vague description of the 2 men, including the one with the puppy dog eyes. I'll be at the Holiday Inn, or you can leave a message with Detective Inspector Blackstone at Millgarth. Fine. Melissa looked at her watch. Look, sorry, but time's pressing. You said there were 2 things. Yeah. We think your husband probably has done a bunk with a lot of money. Enough to set him up for life. But it's a bloody big world. Where do you think he might go? Where did he dream of living? Melissa frowned. Interesting question. You mean where's Danny's Shangri-La, his El Dorado? Yeah, we all have one, don't we? Tahiti. Tahiti? Yes. He liked the idea of bare-breasted native girls serving him cool drinks in coconut shells. She laughed, pushed her chair back, and stood up.
Sorry, but I really do have to go. Of course. Anyway, I'll give what you said some thought, and... She paused. Wait a minute. There was someone. He came to the house once. He did have sort of sad eyes, now I think of it, but I can't think of the name. What were the circumstances? Well, as a solicitor, Danny doesn't do criminal work, but apparently he met this chap in a pub and they got talking. The fellow had been in the army or something in Northern Ireland, and when he got himself arrested, Danny was the only one he knew to call on. What happened? Danny referred him to someone else. How long ago was this? 2 years? Shortly before we separated. What was this man arrested for? Assault or something, a fight. I know it wasn't serious. Look, I really must go. I'll try and remember more, I promise. One more thing. Can you remember the solicitor your husband referred him to? We might be able to trace him through our records. She thought for a moment. Yes, of course. Harvey Atkins. He and Danny are good friends, and Harvey does a fair bit of criminal work. Thank you, Banks said, but she was already dashing away. End of CD 2. CD 3. Ken Blackstone was in his office, bent over a stack of paperwork, when Banks arrived at Millgarth. Couple of interesting developments, Alan. The lab boys say the dirt and gravel on the tyres of the abandoned Escort matched that around Ardbeck Farm, although the rest of it was clean as a whistle. Secondly, airport security at Heathrow found Clegg's red Jag in the long-stay car park. Surprise, surprise. Indeed. Any news from the hospital? No change. But she's stable, at least. Look, Ken, I might have a lead on one of Rothwell's killers. Banks told him what Melissa Clegg had said about the client Clegg had passed on to Harvey Atkins. Blackstone tapped his yellow pencil. Well, since we got the brief's name, we can certainly check the court records. Do you know if the bloke was convicted? No, we'll have to depend on the kindness of microchips. And it might take a while. Banks nodded. What do you know about Tahiti? Bly's men deserted there. Part of French Polynesia. Why? Banks told him what Melissa Clegg had said. And we found his car at Heathrow. Well, we can check on flights. Thanks. Anything else? We finished the house-to-house in Pamela Jeffries Street. Nothing really, except one neighbour remembered hearing some noise about 9:15 Monday. That fits. They said they heard some noise. Yes. Ken, imagine how much they must have made. I know, but round there people wouldn't stop to piss on an Asian if she were on fire. And that's it? Afraid so. The shops usually had windows covered in mesh and were either in dilapidated, graffiti-scarred council estates or obscure streets of pre-war terraced back-to-backs in areas like Hunslet, Holbeck, Beeston and Kirkstall. Around and around they drove, with Hatchley flipping through a well-thumbed A to Z. To Susan it was all very depressing, a far cry from the nice semi in Sheffield where she'd grown up. But Hatchley seemed to relish the task, even though they were getting nowhere. His reputation for laziness, she was beginning to realise, might be unfounded. Hatchley was determined. When he was after something, he didn't let go until he got it. The fifth shop was more modern than the others, a kind of mini-market come off-licence that also sold newspapers and magazines. It was not far from Elland Road, and was run, Hatchley said, by a Mario Nelson, Italian mother, English father. It was immediately clear to Susan that Mario took after his father. She knew there were blonde-haired Italians in the north, but they didn't look as downright Nordic as Mario. In his 50s, tall, slim, and wearing a white smock, he looked far too elegant to be running a shop. But when he saw Hatchley, a look of caution came to his ice-blue eyes. "Hey, Mario, old mate," said Hatchley, lighting up a cigarette. "Long time no see." "There's no smoking here." Hatchley ignored him. "So, how's business?" "Fair." "Doing much special trade?" "Don't know what you mean." "Oh, come off it. You're a filth peddler, Mario. And you know I rank filth peddlers lower than a dollop of dog shit on my shoe. Now then, concentrate. Hatchley described the man in the balaclava. You seen anyone like that, Mario? He's an appetite for shaved pussy. He on your list? Susan saw that Mario recognized the description, or thought he did, and she saw fear. Hatchley saw it too. He dropped his cigarette on the floor and ground it out. Susan, put up the clothes sign, would you? And pull the blinds down. Hey, you can't do that. Mario came out from behind the counter, but Hatchley stood in his way. Right. What's his name? Whose name? Hatchley grabbed Mario by the lapels of his shopcoat and pushed him hard against the shelves. A jar of pickled onions fell to the floor and smashed, infusing the air with the acrid smell of vinegar. Tins dropped and rolled. A packet of spaghetti noodles burst open. Who is he, Mario? Give. I don't know, but he's been in. For your under-the-counter stuff? Shaved pussy? Yeah, that's all I know. You're lying. He twisted Mario's lapels. A jar of instant coffee fell and broke. The name, Mario. All right. Jameson. Mr. Jameson. Hatchley let him go. Address? I'll bet he's on one of your paper routes. Mario paused. Then, rubbing his throat, he went behind the counter and consulted his deliveries ledger. 47 Bridgeport Road. But you won't find him there. Oh? He's cancelled his papers for 3 weeks. Since when? Last Friday. Where's he gone? No idea. Holidays, probably. But look, if you find him, don't tell him you got this from me. Scared of him, then? He's got a reputation. Hatchley bent down and grabbed a pickled onion. After checking to make sure there was no broken glass clinging to it, he popped it in his mouth and smiled. Aye. All right, then. After a light lunch in the police canteen with Blackstone, Banks walked back to the Holiday Inn. There he found 3 messages, one to call Melissa Clegg at the wine shop, one to meet Hatchley and Susan at the Victoria pub behind the town hall as soon as possible, and one to call Blackstone. He went to his room and phoned Melissa first. Oh, yes, Mr. Banks, I've remembered his name, the man Daniel met in the pub. And? Well, I knew there was something particular about it, then it came to me when I was filling some orders. Irish whiskey. Irish whiskey? Yes, I'm sure his name was Jameson. Banks thanked her and called Blackstone. Ah, Alan, we've got some names. And is Jameson among them? Let's look. Yes, Jameson, Arthur. What? Look, I can't talk now. Ken, can you pull his file and meet me at the Victoria in 15 minutes? The Vic? Sure, but 15 minutes then. Banks hung up. It was foolish, Susan knew, but she couldn't help feeling butterflies in her stomach as, carrying a briefcase and clipboard, she walked along Bridgeport Road, a drab street of dirty terraced houses. It was mid-afternoon now. There was no one about. The click of her heels seemed to echo from every building. We know he's not at home, she repeated to herself. He's cancelled his papers, gone on a holiday on the proceeds of killing Rothwell. There's nothing to worry about. But still, she worried. She remembered Rothwell kneeling on the floor in his suit, his head blown to a pulp. And she remembered what Blackstone had said about Jameson at the makeshift briefing in the Victoria. He'd been kicked out of the army after killing in an ambush 2 innocent teenage girls, as well as 1 suspected IRA triggerman. Then he'd drifted around Africa as a mercenary. After that, back home, he'd beaten an Irishman senseless in a pub because of the man's Belfast accent. Susan's heart beat faster now as she lifted the brass knocker of Jameson's house, number 47. She had it rehearsed. If the man with the puppy dog eyes answered the door, she'd raise her clipboard and tell him she was doing market research on neighbourhood shopping habits.
Under no circumstances, Banks had said, was she to enter the house. But nothing stirred. So she relaxed and moved on to number 49. Yes? A wrinkled old lady opened the door. Susan showed her card. D.C. Gay, North Yorkshire Police, Mrs. Gardner. Right. I'd like to talk to you about Mr. Jameson. Oh, he's on his holidays. Why? What's he done now? Something wrong? Why do you ask that? Well, I know he's been in jail, and I've seen him with a gun. A gun? Aye, a shotgun. I saw him cleaning it out back once. He likes to go off shooting God's innocent creatures, even though he's one of that green lot. Well, we need to find him. Any idea where he went? Abroad? Oh, I shouldn't think so. He doesn't like foreigners because they take our jobs. Hates 'em all, does Mr. Jameson. England for the English, he says. Says he likes to drive around English countryside. I don't suppose he left you a key? No. Asked me to keep an eye on the place, though. When did he go? Thursday afternoon. Driving? Of course. What kind of car? A grey one. New. What make? A Granada. He told me when he bought it. He only got it last year. So, M registration then, Susan thought. How was he dressed? Oh, casual-like. Orange anorak, jeans. Was he alone? Aye. Did he take his shotgun with him? I don't know, didn't see it. OK, thank you, Mrs. Gardner. Someone will be along shortly to take a statement. Susan hurried away down the street, heels clicking, to where Banks and the rest waited in their cars in the Tesco car park. It took the locksmith all of 45 seconds to open Jameson's door. Things were moving now. His mugshot and a description of his car had already gone out to forces across the country. They'd got the Granada's number from the licensing centre in Swansea, and local police were warned not to approach him under any circumstances, but simply to observe and report. In Jameson's living room, Banks and Blackstone were examining a small bookcase filled with books on nature, wildlife, English heritage, and the environment. Probably a member of Greenpeace and the National Trust, said Blackstone. Just you wait, they'll call him the Green Killer. Yeah, it's not every murderer has a social conscience, is it? Banks pulled a girly magazine from down the side of a battered armchair. Yeah, a real nature boy. They went into the kitchen where everything was clean and tidy. Dishes put away, surfaces scrubbed clean. Jameson's bedroom was basically clean but untidy. The sheets lay twisted on the bed and clothes lay over the floor. The only reading material here was a British National Party pamphlet on his bedside table, which left the cellar. The chill air gripped them as they went down the dark steps, and Banks could smell mould and damp. Thankfully, though, there was an electric light. Here Jameson had his workbench, complete with vice and expensive toolbox. On the bench lay a box of loose shot and a ripped and crumpled page from a magazine. Banks rubbed his latex-covered index finger over the rough, powder-covered surface, lifted the finger, and sniffed. Gunpowder. Then he pulled open a drawer under the bench. Inside, among a random collection of screws, nails, electrical tape, fuse wire, and sandpaper, he found a half-empty box of ammunition for a 9mm handgun. Right, Ken. We've got the bastard. Banks cadged a lift with Blackstone back to Millgarth, while Susan and Hatchley returned to Eastvale. He asked about Pamela Jeffrey's condition and was told there'd been some improvement, but she was still in intensive care. Then he looked at his watch. 10 to 6. He wanted to go home now, but knew he might not be able to make it tonight. At least he could return to the hotel, have a bath, and phone Sandra. Then, if nothing happened by, say, 8, he would go back to Eastvale. He walked back to the hotel where, this time, there was only the one message for him. Please come to room 408 as soon as you get back. It wasn't signed.
So Banks showed his warrant card to the desk clerk and discovered that the occupant of room 408 was a Mr. Wilson. Odd. He couldn't remember offhand any Mr. Wilson. When the lift stopped at the 4th floor, he followed the arrow to the room and knocked. He debated whether to stand aside, but decided it was only in American films that people shot holes through hotel doors. This one opened abruptly. "About bloody time, Banks," said Dirty Dick Burgess. "There's been developments. Let's get a drink." They drank in the Holiday Inn's idea of a traditional English pub, the Wig and Pen, and Burgess seemed to take a shine to the place. He sat opposite Banks with his pint of lager, lit a Tom Thumb, and looked around. "Not bad. I never did like those places with bedpans on the walls." "Bed warmers." "Whatever. Anyway, what do you think of those two as a couple of bed warmers? Think they fancy us?" Banks turned and saw two attractive women in their late 20s at a nearby table. One had short black hair and good legs. She gave Burgess the eye and whispered in her friend's ear. "Yeah, they do." "You said something about developments." "What?" "Oh, yeah. Fraud squad, boring little fuckers, have evidence Clegg and Rothwell were laundering for Churchill." "Well, that's hardly a development. We're already assuming that." "Ah, but now it's definite." "And why would Churchill use a couple of provincials like Rothwell and Clegg?" "Well, simple. The old boy network. Clegg and Churchill read law together at Cambridge." "And kept in touch?" "Obviously. Clegg's been using St. Corona as a tax shelter for his clients for years." "And what made Clegg choose Rothwell as his partner?" "How would I know? It's your job, Banks. But they clearly knew one another somehow, and it takes one to know one." Burgess looked over at the women and smiled. The black-haired one smiled back, shyly. The other giggled. "My lucky night, I think, son. I'll say one thing for the North, you got some damned accommodating women up here. Right, something else that might interest you. Those two men, the white one and the darky. I wasn't entirely truthful with you." "So you do know who they are?" "Mickey Lanois, Gregory Jackson. Two of Churchill's top enforcers. They came into Heathrow last Friday. Know what their favourite torture is?" Banks didn't want to know, but Burgess would tell him anyway. "Well, they get those little glass files the doctors use, right? Really thin glass. And they put a handful in the victim's mouth, tape the mouth shut securely, and beat him a bit about the face. Or her. Think about it." Churchill thought that one up. He likes to watch. Banks thought and felt his throat constrict. "Anyway, the point is, we know who they are." "No, not entirely. The point is, where are they, and what are you going to do about them?" "Ah, that's out of your hands, Banks. We're keeping tabs, but it's a whole different ballgame. We're talking international politics here. Accept that." "Bollocks. Don't give me that politically sensitive crap. They damn near killed a woman here." Burgess sighed. "Oh dear, I knew you were going to be difficult. Just leave it be. And don't worry, they won't get away with it." Banks sipped his beer. "What are you telling me?" "We'll get 'em. No fuss. No publicity." Banks thought for a moment. "Can I be there when you question them?" Got to you, did it? What they did to the girl? Fancy her, do you, Banks? Nice dusky crumpet, touch of the tar brush." Banks's hand tightened on his pint glass. Why did Burgess always get to him this way? The bastard had a knack of touching exactly the right nerve. Every time. "Okay, if it's possible, I'll arrange it. But no publicity on the Churchill matter, right? Fuck this one up and you'll be in very deep doo-doo indeed." "What about the press?" "They can be dealt with." "Oh, come off it. You can't guarantee that the hotshot investigative reporters won't be all over this one like flies on shit. So maybe they'll hear Churchill's been killed in a coup. Maybe even see a body." "Maybe that'd be best. Less embarrassing all round." Burgess paused. "Except maybe he's got life insurance. And a good plastic surgeon on St. Corona? Look, let's stop pissing around, Banks. I want your promise you won't go to the press about the Churchill angle. Banks lit another cigarette. What could he do? If Lenoir and Jackson were caught and punished, he could live with that. But was Burgess telling the whole truth? He didn't know. All he knew was he could never trust the bastard. But then again, what choice did he have? All right. Good. Burgess reached over and patted his arm. Good. Banks jerked his arm away. Don't push it, there's another thing. What? What happens when we catch Rothwell's killers? Oh, that's up to you. I don't give a monkeys. It's unlikely they know anything about Churchill. They were probably just a pair of hired killers working for Clegg, who's now conveniently disappeared. Any idea where? Nah. But I'll tell you one thing. Churchill's got the memory of an elephant, the reach of a giraffe, and the tenacity of a bloody pit bull. Wherever Clegg is, he won't be there long. So we write Clegg off? I think he's already written himself off. Burgess looked over at the two women. Look, you going to join me? The wife need never know. No, I'm going back home. Suit yourself. Burgess sucked in his gut. Once more under the breach. He strutted over to the other table, pint in hand, smiling. Banks watched the women make room for him. Then he shook his head, drank up, and left. Boredom. They never told you about that in the recruitment drives, P.C. Grant Everett thought as he rolled down the window of the patrol car and lit a cigarette. Next to him, his partner, P.C. Barry Miller, was munching a Mars bar. Ah, well, Grant smiled to himself. Each to his own poison. They were parked in a lay-by between Prince's Risborough and High Wycombe. All around them spread the dark, rolling landscape of the Chilterns, and isolated lights twinkled from scattered farms and cottages. It had stopped raining now, and on a nice day this was an attractive spot, especially in spring, with the bluebells and cherry blossom out. A lorry rumbled by. Occasionally voices cut through the static on the radio, but the messages weren't for them. Right, shall we bugger off then? Barry screwed up the wrapper of his Mars bar and put it in his pocket. Ever the careful one, Grant thought. Wouldn't even be caught littering. Yeah, might as well. Grant reached for his seatbelt. Then they heard the squealing of rubber on wet tarmac. What the fuck was that? On the road, a northbound car skidded as it took the bend too fast. Shall we? Said Barry. My pleasure. Grant loved it when the lights were flashing and the siren screaming. But there was no chase to be had this time. It was over before it began. The car was about 200 yards ahead of them when its driver slowed and pulled over. The number plate, Grant saw, was too muddy to read. He pulled up behind the car and Barry got out. It wouldn't be much, Grant thought as he sniffed the fresh night air through the open window. Maybe a drunk, but it was something to relieve the boredom. Barry was asking the driver for his driving license. He looked at it, passed it back, then asked the man to get out and clean off his number plate. Grant heard him explain that it was an offence to drive with one that is not easily distinguishable. Then he heard Barry speak over his personal radio. 465. Go ahead, 465. The voices crackled unnaturally over the country night air. 10-9 vehicle check, please. Mike 437 Tango Zulu Delta. Stand by. Grant knew it would take a few moments for the control to check the number on the computer, but Barry and the driver seemed to be chatting amiably enough while they waited. Grant looked at the newly cleaned number plate. There seemed to be something familiar about it, and he reached for the briefing sheet beside him. He ran his finger down the list of stolen cars. Nope, not there. A vehicle used in a robbery, perhaps? Then he found it. M437TZD, Grey Granada. Suddenly he felt cold. Owner wanted in connection with murder in Yorkshire. possibly armed and dangerous. Under no circumstances attempt to apprehend. Shit. His legs felt like jelly, and his throat was tight. He hoped the radio operator would understand and give the guy a clean bill of health. The radio crackled back into life. Control to 465? Go ahead, over. Mike 437 Tango Zulu Delta. No reports stolen. Do you require keeper details, over? Affirmative. More static. Grant tensed, hand on door handle. It was taking too long. Keeper is Arthur Jameson, 47 Bridgeport Avenue, Leeds. Is Keeper with you, over? Affirmative. Any problem? She was blowing it, Grant thought. She was nervous, halting. If the suspect couldn't sense there was something wrong, he was an idiot. No reports stolen. You already said that, love. Sorry, stand by. Right, this was it, Grant thought. He wasn't going to let his partner just stand there. But before he got the door half open, he heard 2 dull cracks and saw Barry, all 6'2" and 16 stone of him, drop to the wet road. From his neck, a dark spray of blood fountained high and arced to the ground. Left foot still in the car, right foot on the road, Grant hesitated. Mistake. A bullet shattered the windscreen and took him full in the face, scattering blood, teeth, and bone fragments over the car. After the echo had faded, the Granada sped off into the night, and a nightingale sang again into the vacuum of silence it left behind. The sky was a sheet of grey shale now. Local traffic had been diverted. The road had been cordoned off, and several patrol cars, lights circling, guarded the scene where the Soccos were still working. Banks and Hatchley, who'd driven through the night from Eastvale, stood and looked in silence at the patrol car with the shattered windscreen and at the outline of the body on the tarmac. Detective Superintendent Jarrell of the Thames Valley Police was pacing up and down, his shabby raincoat flapping around his legs. He gestured at the stained tarmac road surface where dark blood had coagulated. It was a monumental cock-up. When Miller called in, the radio operator was new to the job, scared to death. "Any update on the injured officer, sir?" said Banks. "Everett's still hanging on, just. Seems the bullet went through his upper lip and was deflected by bone. The doc says he's got a chance." "Right, you seen enough here?" "I think so." "Me too. Let's go." Jarrell drove them about a mile down the road towards Prince's Risborough, then turned left and bumped along a muddy farm track until they reached an open gate, where he pulled up. As Banks and Hatchley followed him through the gate, they both sank almost to their ankles in mud. In the field beyond, men in white boiler suits and black Wellington boots were working around a car that stood bogged down with its doors open and its chassis streaked with mud and cow shit. It had been found about an hour earlier. "Anything?" Jarrell called to the team. "Only the usual rubbish, sir. Sweet wrappers, road maps. He's taken everything of value. No sign of weapons." Jarrell looked at his watch. "The shooting occurred about 12:30. It's 6:30 now. That gives him a good start." "You know the territory, sir," said Banks. "Where would you go?" "Head for London and out of the country." "So where's the nearest station?" That's the problem. This is commuter country. Nearby there's Prince's Risborough, Saunderton, and High Wycombe on the Chiltern line. If he's headed east, there's Tring, Berkhamsted, or Hemel Hempstead. Or if he headed for Amersham, he could get the Underground. There's no shortage of trains, and they run early. What's his best bet? Probably the Chiltern line. He could even be in London already. If. Banks thought a couple of hours later, as he followed Jarrell into Jameson's rented cottage. If Everett and Miller hadn't stopped Jameson. If Jameson hadn't panicked. If. In an ideal world, they'd have tracked Jameson to this cottage quietly. They'd have surrounded the place, then arrested him, unsuspecting, without a shot being fired. For the stinger was he hadn't known they were after him. Now things were different. Now he was a dangerous man on the run. In the event, they discovered the cottage Jameson was renting through an Aylesbury estate agent shortly after the office opened that Friday morning. Policemen were showing Jameson's photograph and asking the same questions in every estate agent's, hotel and B&B in Buckinghamshire. And they'd got lucky. According to the estate agent, the man had simply dropped in asking after rental cottages in the area, had paid cash, and moved in. Why the Chilterns was anybody's guess. Being a nature lover on holiday, he'd headed simply for the countryside. It could as easily have been the Cotswolds or the Malverns, Banks supposed. The cottage was certainly isolated. It stood at the end of a winding track about 2 miles long. And from the mud on the floor, it looked as if Jameson had returned there after the shooting. In the living room, the contents of his suitcase lay strewn around, including a number of local wildlife guides and a girly magazine. Hatchley flipped through that, tilting the centrefold to get a better look. Then they all followed the mud trail upstairs. At the bottom of the wardrobe lay a 12-bore shotgun wrapped in an oil-stained cloth. Obviously it was too conspicuous for Jameson to take with him, but he still had the handgun. "Can we get this to your lab?" Banks asked Jarrell. "It's probably evidence in a murder case." Jarrell nodded as a message crackled through on his personal radio. "Jarrell, over. HQ, sir. Suspect Arthur Jameson spotted at Aylesbury railway station at 9:53. Bought London ticket. Now on platform. Locals await instructions. Over." "Has he spotted them?" "They say not, sir." "Well, tell them to keep their distance." Jarrell looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. "When's the next train?" 10:12, sir." "Which route?" "Marylebone via Amersham." "Thank you. Stand by." Jarrell turned to Banks. "We can pick that up at Great Missenden or Amersham." "OK, let's do it." They'd been told by the transport police who'd spotted him that Jameson looked like a rambler. He was wearing an orange anorak and grey trousers tucked into walking boots. He was also carrying a rucksack, which no doubt held his gun and money. The train rattled out of the station, and Banks found a seat next to a young woman reading a copy of PC magazine. He had his battered briefcase with him, and from it he took his omnibus paperback copy of War's Sword of Honour trilogy. He opened it at the marker and began to read. Every so often, though, he glanced at the man in the orange anorak, who sat 4 seats down to his left. The rucksack lay on the luggage rack above, and surely the gun would be in there. So he thought they could probably take him right now. He and Hatchley could approach quietly from behind and grab him. But it wasn't worth the risk. The gun might not be in the rucksack. Jameson's trousers were of the many-pocketed kind favoured by ramblers. It could be there, and there were too many civilians present. No, best wait. Superintendent Jarrell had already talked to the yard, who'd promised there would be plainclothes officers, experts at surveillance, waiting at Marylebone, mixed in with the crowds. Some were posing as taxi drivers, and with luck, Jameson would take one of their cabs. Possibly he would know someone in London who could help get him out of the country. But what Banks really hoped was that Jameson would lead them to his accomplice in the Rothwell murder. The train rattled out of Rickmansworth, passed through Harrow, and entered a landscape of factory yards, warehouses, schoolyards, housing estates, and concrete overpasses. Before long, the people in the carriage were standing up to get their bags as the train rumbled slowly into Marylebone Station. Ahead of him, Banks spotted Hatchley in the crowd that shuffled through the ticket gate. Jameson, in his anorak, was easy enough to keep in sight as he made his way to the exit and into a taxi. Banks opened the door of the next one. Hatchley was beside him now, and Banks was dying to jump in and say, "Follow that taxi," but the driver didn't want to let them in. He leaned over and tried to pull the door shut, holding up a police ID card. "Sorry, mate, police business. There's one behind." But Banks took his own card out. "Snap, now open the fucking door." "Right, sorry, sir." The driver began to follow Jameson's cab through the thick traffic on Marylebone Road. "Is that one of your men driving the taxi ahead?" "Yes, sir. DC Formby. He's good." We won't lose the bastard." With excruciating slowness, the taxis edged south to Kensington and into a side street. Then Jameson's taxi stopped outside a 5-story white building that announced itself as Hotel on the smoked glass over the doors. Jameson went inside and his taxi drove off. "Right, we've got the bastard. Now we wait for the reinforcements." For Gray, the hotel manager could have given John Major a run for his money. His suit was grey, his hair was grey, his voice was grey. At the moment, his face was grey too. He'd obviously not seen so many rough-looking, badly dressed coppers gathered in one place since they stopped showing repeats of the Sweeney. Leather jackets, anoraks, T-shirts, jeans and grubby trainers abounded. There wasn't a uniform or tie in sight. 2 of them wore bulletproof vests. Vest 1, the taller, was called Spike, probably because of his hair, and his smaller associate was called Shandy. Spike was doing the talking. "Okay, Squire," he said to the wide-eyed manager. "Our boss don't want a lot of fuss. We go in, disarm him nice and quiet, and Bob's your uncle. Now, we need to clear the floor. Is there anyone else up there apart from Jameson?" The manager looked at the keys. "Only room 316. Chambermaids? Finished. Good." Spike turned to one of the leather jackets. "Smithy, get number 316 out quietly, okay?" "Right, boss." Spike turned to Banks. "You know this Jameson, right, sir?" "Not personally." He filled Spike in. "And he's shot a policeman. 2. One's dead, the other's in the operating room waiting to find out if he's got a brain left." Spike slipped a stick of Wrigley's gum from its wrapper and popped it into his mouth as Smithy came downstairs with a dazed old dear in a pink dressing gown. Then the desk phone rang. The manager answered it, turning even more grey. "Yes, of course. At once, sir." He put the phone down. It was him. Room 324. "What's he want?" "A roast beef sandwich and a bottle of beer sent to his room." "Right." Spike grinned at Banks. "Opportunity knocks. I don't suppose you're armed?" "No." "Better stay down here then, sir." "Sorry, but I can't take the responsibility. Shandy, come with me. The rest of you stay and make sure no one gets in or out. You got the back covered?" "Yes, sir," said one of the anoraks. "Good." But Banks gave Spike and Shandy a floor start, then slipped into the stairwell. At the first floor landing, he heard someone wheezing behind him and turned. "I thought you might like some company, sir," said Hatchley. They climbed the next flight. "Mind if I ask what we're doing this for, sir?" Hatchley whispered. "To see what happens. I've got a funny feeling about this." Something Spike said. When they reached the 3rd floor, Banks put his arm out to hold Hatchley back. Spike and Shandy had drawn their weapons and were walking slowly along the worn carpet towards Jameson's room. Spike knocked on the door. "Room service." The door rattled open, on a chain by the sound of it. Someone swore loudly, then Shandy reared back and kicked the door open. The 2 men charged inside, and Banks heard 2 shots in close succession, followed after a pause of 3 or 4 seconds by another, not quite as loud. Then he saw Spike come out of the room and lean against the door jamb, and he and Hatchley began walking along the corridor. Spike saw them coming. "Silly bugger had to try it on, didn't he?" They walked into the room, and Banks could smell cordite. Jameson had slid down into a sitting position on the floor, back to the wall, legs splayed, leaving a thick red snail's trail of blood smeared on the wallpaper. His spaniel eyes were open. The front of his shirt, over the heart, was a tangle of dark red rag and tissue. His hands lay by his side, one holding his gun. Another dark wet patch spread between his legs. Urine. Banks thought of the chair at Arkbeck Farm, where this man had scared Alison Rothwell so much that she too had wet herself. Jesus. "We'd no choice," said Spike behind him. "He fired first." 2 shots in close succession, followed by another sounding different. Our boss tells us we don't want a lot of fuss. Banks looked at the two policemen. Give my regards to Dirty Dick, won't you? Who's that then? Said Shandy. But Spike was grinning. Will do, sir. It was Saturday afternoon, 2 days after Jameson's shooting, when Banks walked into Leeds Infirmary. He'd always hated hospitals. They gave him the creeps. That morning he'd wrapped things up with Ken Blackstone and taken time to buy some compact discs at the Classical Record Shop. Later he'd head back to Eastvale for D.S. Richmond's farewell bash. He followed the signs and, at last, found Pamela Jeffrey's room. The brown paper package he'd brought he put down on the bedside table. Pamela looked at it with her good eye. The other was covered in bandages. Grapes. Banks felt embarrassed. It's what you bring to hospital, isn't it? Pamela smiled, but then decided it hurt too much. You're going to be okay, the doc says. You'll be playing again in no time. A bit longer than that, maybe, said Pamela from the side of her mouth. But you will play. She looked at her bandaged right hand. They broke 2 fingers on my bowing hand. I should think myself lucky, I suppose. If they'd broken my wrist, that might have ended my career. How long are they going to keep you in here? Who knows? I'd go home right now, but my leg's broken. She paused. Is this an official visit? Have you come about the men who hurt me? No, but we know who they are. They won't get away with it. Was it the same men who killed Robert? No. Banks gave her the gist of what had happened with Jameson. So one got away? So far. That's not bad going. 50% success rate. Well, it's better than the police average, I suppose. She rested her bandaged hand on his. Don't look so worried. I'll be all right. And don't blame yourself for what's happened to me. Right. I'll try not to. Yes, Pamela would be fine. Her wounds would heal. Her beauty regenerate. She'd be as good as new. But would she ever fully recover inside? That he didn't know. Look, will you come and see me again? I mean, when it's over, when I'm home, will you? Sure I will, Banks said, not sure at all, guilty about the feelings he'd had for her. Mean it? He looked into her almond eye and saw the black shape of fear at its centre. He leaned forward and brushed his lips against her good cheek. Of course I mean it. And he did. Why was he born so beautiful? Why was he born so tall? He's no bloody use to anyone, he's no bloody use at all. Richmond took the Yorkshire compliment delivered by Hatchley and a cat's choir of PCs very well, Banks thought. Speech! Speech! Hatchley shouted. Embarrassed, Richmond cleared his throat. Thank you very much, and thanks for the CD-ROM. It's been a pleasure working with you. I know you'll probably think I'm a traitor going down south. Here a chorus of boos interrupted his speech. But as soon as I got those buggers down there sorted out, I'll be back. Thank you. They were in the back room of the Queen's Arms, and Banks was leaning against the bar, a pint of Theakston's in hand, next to Gristhorpe. He knew he should have been happier to see the end of the Rothwell case. Jameson had killed Rothwell. Jameson was dead. Justice had been done, after a fashion. So forget it. But he couldn't seem to get rid of a niggling feeling. The men who'd beaten Pamela hadn't been caught yet. Together with Jameson's accomplice, that still left 3 on the loose. A 25% success rate only. Not satisfactory at all. But it wasn't only that. It was all too neat and tidy somehow. Everything ready for Martin Churchill to slip into the country one night with a new face and a clean, colossal bank account and retire quietly to Cornwall, guarding the secrets of those in power. "Sir?" Susan Gay approached Banks and asked if she could have a word. They found a quiet corner. "Sir, I've not had a chance to talk to you since you got back, but there's a couple of things you might be interested in." "I'm listening." Susan told him about her talk with Tom Rothwell and what he'd seen the day he'd followed his father into Leeds. "We managed to get the artist's impression in the papers on Thursday, sir, while you were down south." "Any luck?" "Well, yes and no. We found out her name's Julia Marshall from Adel in North Leeds, a schoolteacher. We got phone calls from her colleagues. Apparently she was a shy, private person." "Was?" "Well, she's disappeared, sir, and I think we should try to find her." "You're right. There are too many bloody disappearances in this case for my liking. Anything else?" "No. But it's not over yet, is it, sir?" "No, Susan, I don't think it is. It's a loose end. We'll follow it up first thing tomorrow." Banks walked back to the bar, lighting a cigarette. But at that moment, Sergeant Rowe, who'd been manning the front desk across the street, pushed through the crowd of drinkers. "Phone call, sir. Important, he says." "Shit, did he say who?" "No, sir." "All right." He couldn't ignore the call, but irritated nonetheless, he crossed Market Street and went into the station. "You can take it here, sir," said Rowe at the desk. Banks picked up the receiver. "Banks." "What do you want, the good news or the bad? It's Superintendent Burgess here." Banks felt his stomach start to churn. "Just tell me." "OK, the two goons that beat up the tart of colour." "You got them?" "Not exactly. They slipped through our net, that's the bad news." "Where'd they go?" "Home, of course. St. Corona. That's the good news." "What's good about that?" "Well, seems they didn't know they'd become persona non grata there." "And?" "I have it on good authority they've both been eating glass." "They're dead?" "Of course they're bloody dead." "Why?" "Things are in a delicate balance, Banks. Let's say that their bungling around England drawing attention to themselves didn't help." "And did you know that in advance? Did you even try to find them?" "Now, how could you even think that of me?" "Easy. The same way you made damn sure Jameson didn't survive to say anything embarrassing in court. They shot the bastard down, Burgess." "Superintendent to you, Banks. What I heard is he shot first." "Bollocks. They shot him, then fired his gun to make it look that way. And you know what gave them away? I'm sure you're going to tell me. They left the gun in his hand for me to see. Procedure is you disarm a suspect, first thing, dead or not." "Well, hooray for you, Sherlock. But it don't really matter, does it? Officially, you weren't there. You were ordered to stay on the ground floor. And I wouldn't want to see you throw your career down the tubes over this by rocking the boat. The official verdict is the one that counts." "Not to me. Leave it, Banks. It's over." "Oh, one more thing. We found an address book in Jameson's stuff. Name Donald Pembroke ring any bells?" "No. An old army crony of his. Seems this Pembroke recently inherited a lot of money, according to his neighbour. First thing he did was buy a fast sports car cash down. 2 days later, doing 90 on a B road in Kent, he lost control and ran it into a tree." "And?" "Well, he's dead, isn't he? So don't say there's no justice in the world, Banks. Right, have a good life." Burgess hung up abruptly, leaving Banks to glare into the receiver. "Everything all right, sir?" said Rowe. "Yes, fine. Bloody fine and dandy." And Susan's words echoed in his mind. "It's not over yet, is it, sir?" Well, no, it bloody wasn't. Banks sat at the taverna by the quayside, sipping an ice-cold Beck's and smoking a duty-free Benson and Hedges. A few fishing craft were bobbing gently on the calm water. When he'd finished his cigarette, he popped a dolmas into his mouth and followed it with a black olive. It was a small island, one village built up the hillside, and though it got its share of tourists in season, none of the big cruise ships came. Banks had arrived on the regular ferry service from Piraeus, and he needed a while to collect his thoughts. He'd already contacted the Greek police, and the legal machinery was ready to grind into action. Christ, it was hot, though, even in the shade. He paid for his food and drink and set off along the dirt track up the hill. There were poppies by the roadside, and delicate lavender flowers, and mingled with their scents, he thought he recognized thyme and rosemary. The house he wanted, he'd been told, was on his right, large, with a high-gated white wall and shaded courtyard. And it wasn't difficult to spot. The ochre gate was unlocked, and a crocalia pathway of black and white pebbles led to the door. Expensive, definitely. The door was ajar, and he could hear voices. It sounded like the BBC World Service news. He paused, then knocked at the door. He heard a movement. The voices stopped. Someone opened the door. "Mr. Rothwell," he said, holding up his card. "Mr. Keith Rothwell." "You're alone, then?" "Yeah." "Well, you'd better come in." Banks followed Rothwell into a bright room where a ceiling fan spun. The walls were plastered white, the floor was flagged, and it was sparsely furnished. He could see the sea below through the blue-shuttered window. "Hot, isn't it? Can I get you something?" "Thanks. Anything cold?" Rothwell went to the kitchen door. "Don't worry. I won't run away." "No, there's nowhere to run." A minute later, Rothwell came back with a glass and an iced bottle of Grolsch. He was wearing a peach short-sleeved shirt, white shorts, and brown leather sandals. The receding sandy hair had bleached in the sun, and he had a good tan for such a fair-skinned person. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his grey eyes were steady. He looked nothing at all like the photograph of Daniel Clegg, but was slim and in good shape. About all they did have in common, apart from the hair colour, blood group, and an appendix scar. "Anyone else here?" said Banks. "Julia's gone down to the shops. She won't be long." Rothwell opened a tin of Pepsi. The gas hissed out. "How did you find me?" "Through Julia. It was mostly routine once I knew what I was looking for. We checked travel agents, then contacted the local police through Interpol. 2 English strangers matching your descriptions had a lease on a house here. Didn't take long, really. And I planned it all so very carefully. I thought I'd left enough red herrings to cover my tracks pretty well." "Have you any idea what you've done to your family?" "No. It wasn't a family. That was a sham, a facade. There was no love in the house. Mary and I hadn't slept together in years. So why not get a divorce like anyone else? Why this elaborate scheme?" "Well, seeing you're here, I assume you know most of it." "Humour me." Rothwell sipped some Pepsi. "Well, I might have asked for a divorce eventually, but I'm not sure she'd have let me go too easily. But the way things turned out, I had to appear dead. If he thinks I'm alive, there'll be no escape anyway." "Churchill?" "Yes. He found out I was taking rather more than I was entitled to." "How did you know he knew?" "When you play the kind of games I did, it pays to have information. A source on the island tipped me off that Churchill knew and was pressuring Clegg to do something about it. And it made sense. Daniel had been behaving oddly lately, nervous about something. Yes, the bastard was planning to have me executed." "So you had him killed instead?" Rothwell gazed out of the window at the sea. "It was him or me. I beat him to it, that's all. Someone had to die violently, and we looked enough alike." "Without a face, you mean?" I didn't look in the barn. I couldn't." "I bet you couldn't. Go on." "We were about the same age, build, and hair colour. I knew he'd had his appendix out, even that his blood group was the same as mine." "How?" We were talking once about blood tainted by HIV. He wondered if he had a greater chance of catching it from a transfusion because he shared Group O with 40% of the male population. So you got the idea of passing him off as you? Yes, there was this man Jameson that Daniel knew. We'd all met in the Eagle a couple of times. He'd boasted about being a mercenary and doing anything for money. So how much did you pay him? 50,000 and a plane ticket to Rio. I thought he'd disappear for good. First mistake. What happened? Banks told him about the wadding and about Jameson's attitude to foreigners. And he killed one policeman and seriously wounded another. I'm sorry, but that wasn't my fault. You can't blame me for what Jameson did, can you? Can't I? Banks lit a cigarette. Let's get back to Clegg. How did you get involved? We met in the George in Leeds. They have jazz there Thursdays. It was after I left Hatchard and Pratt and business wasn't exactly booming for me. Anyway, we got talking, exchanged cards, and he began to put a bit of work my way. Turns out some of it was a bit shady, though I wasn't aware at the time. Not that I wouldn't have done it anyway. Then, 3 years back, Daniel's old Cambridge friend, Churchill, decided to rearrange his finances. Daniel needed my expertise, and it looked like a license to print money, so why wouldn't I want in? And how did you arrange it all, the murder, the escape? Rothwell paused. Outside, gulls screamed as they circled the harbour looking for fish. You must go back about 18 months to understand. Daniel and I were doing fine laundering Churchill's money. There I was hiding literally millions of pounds, and it wasn't difficult to hide some for myself. Shell companies, numbered accounts, dummy corporations, property. I was getting rich quick, and I should have been happy. But I wasn't. Life just seemed to have lost its savour. I felt I was shrivelling up inside, old before my time. Midlife crisis, I suppose. But I couldn't see the point of all that bloody money. Mary hated me. My children hated me. And I was beginning to hate myself. Banks saw that Rothwell had picked up the empty Pepsi tin and had squeezed it until it buckled in his grip. I was the dull, boring accountant. But I hadn't always been so bloody bored or boring. Believe it or not, I used to go dancing, drinking with the lads, have a flutter on the horses. I had friends. Go on. So, I invented Robert Calvert. Picked the name from The Economist. Clegg thought it was a wild idea. He helped me get a bank account and credit cards. I rented the flat, bought new clothes, and God, you've no idea how good it felt. I'd go to the bookies, listen to trad in pubs, things I hadn't done since my 20s. What about Pamela Jeffries? What about her? Banks told him. Oh, my God. It wasn't meant to be like that. I'd never have hurt Pamela. We had a wonderful time. I was astounded she fancied me. So what came between you? I met Julia. How? Would you believe, on a bus? She left her umbrella and I grabbed it and dashed after her. I fell in love with her the moment I saw her. She was so beautiful, so delicate. Everything I've ever wanted. And it's mutual. And after I met her, nothing else mattered. I knew we had to get away, find our Eden, if you like, our paradise. I had to get a new life, a new identity. I'd already created Calvert successfully enough, but I had to leave him behind. It wasn't very difficult anyway to go on and create a third identity. David Norcliffe. I shuffled money into various bank accounts over a period of several weeks. How much? 3, 4 million? I don't know exactly. Enough to last us our lifetime anyway. And there was plenty for my family. They're well provided for. Believe me, they'll be better off without me. No one was supposed to get hurt. Except Clegg. I told you that wasn't my fault. And Julia knows nothing about that. She's a complete innocent. Am I right you took Clegg to the Calvert flat to get his fingerprints there? Yes, on the Monday. I'd cleaned the place thoroughly, Then he came over and I showed him around, had him touch just about everything in the place. I was careful to make mine blurred. And you knew we'd find out about Calvert, about Clegg, and the money laundering. Of course. It was part of the plan. It was all meant to confuse you, lead you into a dead end. But please believe me, Pamela wasn't meant to be a part of it, except maybe to confirm the Calvert identity. I thought she might contact the police if she saw my picture in the papers. I left a careful trail for you going the wrong way. I knew you'd unlock my computer and realise I'd been laundering money for Churchill, and I left a letter for Clegg in a locked file, but I never sent it. I knew you'd get at that too and get on to Daniel. Then you'd assume he'd had me killed and disappeared with the money. Oh, we did. We did. Then why are you here? Because I'm a persistent bastard. There were too many loose ends. We couldn't find any trace of Clegg, no matter how hard we tried. But I think it was the connection with Julia that really did for you. How did you find out about her? Pamela Jeffries said she thought you were in love, and I began to wonder how much it would upset the apple cart if you fell in love as Calvert. How would you handle it? Then Tom came back for your funeral. Ah, yes, Tom. I know it's old-fashioned of me, but I still happen to believe that homosexuality is an aberration, an abomination of nature, and not an alternative lifestyle. Yeah. Well, you made him angry. He followed you once to Leeds, and he saw you with Julia Marshall. You didn't know that, did you? Christ, no, I didn't. Well, he gave us an accurate description of Julia. We ran the artist's impression in the Yorkshire Post, and a colleague of hers came forward, then her family. We discovered she'd suddenly resigned teaching and told everyone she was going abroad, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but she wouldn't divulge any details. Then she disappeared about 3 days before your apparent murder. Well, we might have been a bit slow on the uptake, but we're not stupid. Her friends and colleagues mentioned how she was fascinated by Greece. You didn't think we'd try to find her, did you? No. Why should you want to waste the time and money? Any more than I thought you'd do tests to check if it really was my body in the garage. Banks stared out over the pink and purple flowers in the window box at the barren hillside. No. When the fingerprints at Calvert's flat matched the corpses, they didn't think they needed to look any further. But they should have established the body's identity beyond doubt, reconstructed the teeth, checked dental records. That was an oversight. Understandable, but an oversight nevertheless. So how did you handle the killing? Jameson said he needed someone else, and I left it to him. He got Pembroke, but I told them not to harm Alison in any way. Considerate of you. Rothwell paused. Well, they held Alison, then tied Mary up when we got home. They picked Clegg up after dinner. I knew he always used a trattoria near the office on Thursdays. That's why I chose that day. You see, I thought of everything. Mary and I ate at Mario's, so even the stomach contents would match. They had knocked Clegg out and secured him earlier. I told them to use handcuffs to avoid rope burns on his wrists. In the barn, we got him into my clothes. He was groggy by then, starting to come round, and was on his hands and knees. Jameson put the shotgun to the back of his head, and I turned away. Afterwards, we went through the woods, and they drove me to Leeds. I drove Clegg's Jaguar to Heathrow wearing gloves. Then I left the country as David Norcliffe. I already had a passport and bank accounts in that name. Finally, I joined Julia here. It was all prearranged. But, as the poet said, the best laid plans. I'm not going back, you know. You can't make me. Oh, I know there are extradition treaties, but those procedures take time. You can't simply take me in like some bounty hunter. No, I can't. But then that was never my intention. Banks heard the gate open and walked over to the window. A pale, beautiful blonde woman in a yellow sundress had walked into the courtyard and stopped to check on the potted plants. She was carrying a basket of fresh bread. Looks like Julia's back. Doesn't tan well, does she? Rothwell crossed the room and looked out. Listen, she knows nothing, Banks. You have to believe that. I told her I had business problems and had to burn a lot of bridges if we were to be together, so leave her alone. They could hear her humming softly as she rubbed the leaves on a pot of basil and sniffed her fingers. Banks kept his voice low. I'd rather you made a clean breast of it, a confession. You never know, it might even go in your favour. Juries love lovers. No, you're mad if you think I'd give all this up willingly. You can't buy paradise with blood, Keith. You do some time, of course. But if you tell us everything you know about that bastard Churchill's finances, we can go public and make sure he never sets foot in the country, even if he turns up looking like Mr. Bean. We could offer you protection, perhaps another identity, another new life. By the time you got out, Churchill would be another of history's unpleasant footnotes, and Julia would still be waiting. You're insane. I'd kill you before I'd do that. No, you wouldn't. And besides, there'd be others after me. Rothwell stared at him. Do you know what will happen if I go back? It might not be half as bad as what will happen if I let Churchill know you're still alive. He has a long reach and a nasty line in revenge, they say. Julia was moving toward the door now. And it wouldn't stop at you. Rothwell froze. No, you wouldn't do that. At that moment, Banks hated himself probably more than at any other time in his life. He even felt sorry for Rothwell. But then he remembered Pamela Jeffries. This bastard had caused enough trouble already. For this man's gamble on paradise, Daniel Clegg lay in his grave with his head blown off. Barry Miller had died on a wet road at midnight, and Grant Everett would have to spend his next few years relearning how to walk and talk. And much further away, but no less implicated, was a dictator who got fat while his people starved, a man who liked to watch people eat glass, a man who, if Banks could help it, would never enjoy a peaceful retirement in the English countryside, no matter what he had on some powerful members of the establishment. Try me, he said. Suddenly all the life seemed to drain out of Rothwell. He now resembled nothing more than a tired, middle-aged accountant. And Banks felt dirty. But Rothwell believed him now, and that was what mattered. Then the door opened, and Julia drifted in, all blonde and yellow, with a big smile for Rothwell. Hello, darling. Oh, I see we've got company. How nice.